Chapter 876. Seeing Feng Ling's expression, Fat Tai knew that Feng Ling was not one to joke around. He shifted his gaze away and moved closer to Li Nanheng with a chuckle. Scram. Li Nanheng frowned and impatiently moved the stool under him away. Boss, Fat Tai still moved closer shamelessly and said in a low voice that only he could hear, "If you're really here for Feng Ling, we can give you some advice. Putting aside the fact that you're our boss, just based on the amount of meat you have, if you're really interested in Feng Ling, we'll definitely help." Before he could finish speaking, Li Nanheng once again kicked him to the side. Fat Tai immediately used his fat body to slam into De Bin, who was behind him. The moment he fell into De Bin's arms, he raised a finger and pinched his throat like a woman. "Io. De Bin Gidge, your legs are so hard." De Bin's lips twitched. Scram. Laughter immediately filled the tent. Fat Tai scrambled to his feet and snorted coquettishly. After taking 2 steps outside, he suddenly turned back. "Big Bin Gidge, come help me light up the charcoal in the grill. Boss even brought us so much charcoal that's easy to burn. These few days, the off-road vehicle is practically a treasure trove. Whatever we want, we can get it. Yes, yes, yes. This old man feels like I've reached the pinnacle of life with all this meat. Isn't it easy to reach the pinnacle? It seems like we're just short of a girl. If I can have a girl as my companion, I'm willing to stay in this Rogers Pass forever. I've lived for more than 20 years, but I've never even touched a girl's hand." Fat Tai and De Bin brought the grill in. Everyone sat around the grill and began to install it. They placed the charcoal in the grill and made a tool to guide the smoke out of the tent. They were extremely busy and careful, as if the grill was a rare treasure. If anyone was the slightest bit careless, the people next to them would definitely shout, "Gentler, gentler. Brothers, our happiness these few months depends on it. Don't spoil it. If it's really broken, boss definitely won't send us another one." As they spoke, they deliberately looked back at Li Nanheng, hoping to hear Boss Li say, "It's okay. I'll come again next time." However, Li Nanheng said expressionlessly, "If it's broken, put it on the fire and roast it yourself. Even primitive people can roast meat. You live in this era and can't even eat a piece of meat without the stove? My 11 base doesn't need idiots like you." Yes, yes, yes. Boss is right. Boss is right. Boss's words are the imperial edict. Boss is our wind vane. Boss is... Stop sucking up. Hurry up and light up the stove. We're all hungry. De Bin kicked Fatty's wriggling butt. Afterward, the group of people busily cut off a large piece of frozen meat and brought it in to cut it into smaller pieces. They busied themselves with melting the meat and preparing the seasoning. Feng Ling cooperated by the side to boil water and prepare food. Li Nanheng watched this group of brats who could still find happiness because of such a small amount of food. Although his face was expressionless, there was a trace of warmth in his eyes. The man sat quietly by the side and watched them work. After watching for a while, he turned to look at Feng Ling, who was putting dry seasoning into a plate and making it wet. He looked at the boy who had already taken off his thick winter clothes but was still wearing a thin down jacket and down pants. He then looked at her slightly pink face under the light of the fire. Li Nanheng did not speak. He casually picked up a cigarette and lighter, stood up and walked out of the tent. The tent was bustling with noise for a long time. When the meat was almost cooked, the group of people happily sat where they were. Apart from the fact that they could not drink alcohol, this barbecue was perfect. They were here to guard against the mafia lurking nearby. Even if they did not need to train every day, they absolutely could not drink alcohol. Regardless of day or night, they had to maintain absolute sobriety. Otherwise, if there was really an enemy nearby, it would be too late to defend. Where did Boss go? That's right. Where's Boss? Wasn't he there earlier? The few of them glanced at the position where Li Nanheng had previously sat, but did not see him. Earlier, they were all busy preparing the meat and did not notice when Boss had left. Feng Ling prepared the seasoning and handed it to them. She also turned to look at the position where Li Nanheng had previously sat. After standing silently for a moment, she picked up the winter clothes by the side, put them on and walked out. When she walked out of the tent, she did not see Boss. At this time of night, the wind was even stronger and colder. It was extremely cold. She put on her hat and zipped up completely. She walked out and finally saw a faint orange light on the cliff of the snowy mountain in front of her. Someone was smoking there. She walked over. When she walked behind the man, she glanced at the snow behind him. It was snowing again. The footprints he had left when he walked here had been half covered by the snow. It could be seen that he had been standing here for a while. "Boss, the meat is almost ready. You drove all the way from the center of Montana. I guess you haven't eaten anything yet. Go in and eat." Foamling walked up and stood by the man's side. Li Nanheng stood against the wind and snow, casually put out the cigarette butt, and slowly exhaled a thin layer of smoke from his mouth. In this environment, it was hard to tell whether what he exhaled was smoke or breath. However, under the pure white snow, the sea at the border of Montana could not be seen in the distance. Most of it was covered by glaciers and ice, and they could not see the end of it. Behind them, there were a few tents with a few lights. It was like their camp here, and it was like a warm place to return to. Because of the snow, even though it was night, with the lights behind them and the moonlight in the sky, the entire world was not so dark. Even the man stood here quietly, as though he had left the world and stood alone. His tall and straight figure made one's heart tremble. In this kind of damn place, the snow scenery is not bad. The night is not bad either. The man did not look at her, but looked into the distance. It's rare to see an endless glacier. I originally thought that most of the glaciers here were steep cliffs. It looks good now. It's not so steep. Chapter 877. Li Nanheng heard a hint of provocation in her tone. Perhaps it wasn't a provocation, but at least her heart was really calm. She didn't even feel that this place was torturous. Instead, it became a kind of enjoyment. He glanced at her coldly. Foamling was originally shorter than him. Now that she was wearing thick clothes, she was bulging like a little black bear in a spacesuit. The sarcastic words that were about to come out of her mouth were replaced by, "Why should I rub your sharpness? Everyone who came out of 11 base should have the sharpness that comes out of the base. There's no need to polish your edges and corners." Foamling didn't speak. She looked behind her and was about to urge him to go back to eat barbecue with her. However, the man turned his head and looked into the distance. He asked mildly, "After living for more than 20 years, I find that whether it's stepping on landmines to traverse the jungle or charging into the enemy's camp under the barrel of a terrorist's gun, I don't have more courage than admitting that I like you. So, you'd rather raise your gun and be punished to this kind of place. Is it because you like women and have no interest in me?" Foamling. "Boss, this cold wind is biting cold. Even with such thick clothes, I feel cold standing here. Let's not talk about this topic, okay?" Foamling swallowed and did not speak. If she was a man, of course, she should like women. However, the key point was that she was not a man. Right now, she was very conflicted. She didn't know what it meant to like someone, but she seemed to feel that she liked him. Why did she resist? It was probably because she wasn't prepared at all when she was suddenly stamped. Besides, Boss Lee was usually the boss in her eyes, but if she really didn't like him, not to mention that night in his room, if any man dared to press her against the wall and kiss her when they were out on a mission in the bar, she would probably slap him in the face. There was only the howling of the cold wind. There was no reply from Foamling. Li Nanheng seemed to have long been used to her avoiding the topic. He only looked at her mildly. "If you don't want to talk about me, then let's talk about you. A 17-year-old boy like you, do you like a fussy little girl like Qin Shuk? Or a slightly more intellectual and approachable type like Wen Liqing?" "Boss, I've only met that Qin Shuk twice. How could I like her? In my eyes, Miss Qin is a very lively and cheerful girl. If she is willing to be my friend, I may accept it, but if it's a relationship, it's definitely impossible." Foamling raised her hand to cover her painful face with her sleeve and said in a muffled voice, "Boss, I've only met that Qin Shuk twice." As she spoke, she thought of Dr. Wen's sister and said, "As for Miss Wen, even if I like her, it won't of me of her. Of boss. It is definitely not of boss." Li Nanheng was about to take another cigarette and put his hand in his trouser pocket. Hearing her words, he paused and turned his deep, black eyes to her. Me and her? Boss, Lee of. He of Ling of Lee of Lee of Lee of boss, of boss, of Nanoff of Lee of the Ling of you of. And boss, you seem to be very patient with others, but you seem to be very patient with Miss Wen, and you seem to be very familiar with her. Li Nanheng took out his hand, but did not take out the cigarette. He only sneered. So that day you stood at the door of the infirmary for so long, and this is all you saw? Feng Ling retracted her gaze from his face and turned to look at the glacier in the distance. I didn't stand for long. I just went over to take a look. I didn't want to disturb your conversation. Li Nanheng snorted. Wen Liqing often comes to the base, but it has nothing to do with me. I have always hated those women who pester me like sticky candy. Usually, when I return to the Li family to attend various occasions, I will avoid those women. So far, no woman dares to sneak into the base to pester me. 11 base is not a place that anyone can enter. Then for a woman to come to a place like 11 base so frequently, of course, the only reason is for a man, but not for me. She and I are just childhood friends, and we are very familiar with each other. And because she doesn't have any bad intentions towards me and is just a friend, I don't have any wariness toward her. After Feng Ling slowly digested his words, her head seemed to be covered with a layer of doubt. Then who is she doing this for? There are so many men in this base, and most of them are very outstanding, but I don't see her having too much contact with any of them. It was rare to see Feng Ling's curious eyes. Li Nanheng smiled, glanced at her curious expression, and said to her mercifully, "For Dr. Wen." Feng Ling's eyes were filled with curiosity. She was very curious. Feng Ling's expression first changed to one of confusion, then surprise, and finally shock. Isn't Dr. Wen her brother? Yes. Then she did this for Dr. Wen? Feng Ling's brain was a bit confused for a moment. Li Nanheng didn't explain much, but just said, I don't know how to explain it, but Wen Liqing has been chasing after Dr. Wen for so many years. Her brother studied medicine, and she also studied medicine. In order to avoid her, Dr. Wen would rather give up a good job and work in the infirmary of 11 base. Wen Liqing also ignored Dr. Wen's advice and often ran to the base. Seeing that she was also a doctor, the base gave her special privileges and allowed her to enter. If it were anyone else, it would be impossible for them to have such an opportunity to enter and exit at will. So, when Liqing was chasing after her brother, how could biological siblings pursue each other? After chasing after him, could biological siblings fall in love and marry each other? Although she was puzzled, after all, it had nothing to do with her. Feng Ling didn't know why when she heard that Wen Liqing had nothing to do with Boss Li. The lump in her heart suddenly seemed to be so tight and uncomfortable. She changed the topic. Boss, if we don't go in, we will be buried here by the snow. As she spoke, she glanced at the footprints behind her, which had almost been covered by the snow, leaving only faint footprints. Seeing that Feng Ling was wearing such thick clothes and had been covering her face with her cuffs, but her forehead and cheeks were still faintly red because of the wind, Li Nanheng didn't say more and turned to go back. Feng Ling also went back. Chapter 878. The sky grew darker, and the wind and snow outside grew heavier. Thankfully, the tent was sturdy and warm, so it was not affected at all. Feng Ling placed the meat they had left on the stove and roasted it for another minute to heat it up. She then placed it on Li Nanheng's plate, piece by piece. She only kept a few pieces for herself. She was about to place the plate down when she found that the side had not been touched. She turned to look at Li Nanheng, who had been sitting quietly by the side without eating. Boss, why aren't you eating? I've been on the road for a whole day. I don't have an appetite, the man said as he placed the plate of meat in front of her. You eat. Fatai, De Bin, and the others. Was this a public display of male and female dog food? Ahem, boss, it's almost 9 o'clock now. I'll return to the tent next door first. You and Feng Ling eat first. After one of them finished speaking, the others all found their own excuses. In less than a few minutes, they all left. Ling looked at the few prawns on the grill and then at the plate in front of her. She picked up a piece of meat and placed it in her mouth. She then turned to the man sitting by the side. "Boss, I don't usually eat much meat. I can't eat so much. This place is very cold, especially after midnight. If you don't eat something, your resistance to the cold will be very poor. You should eat some." Seeing that she really did not have an appetite, Li Nanheng reached out to take the chopsticks in her hand and the plate. After eating about 5 or 6 pieces of meat with her chopsticks, he placed the chopsticks and plate back in her hand. "Ling, eat it all." He glanced at the remaining pieces of meat. Ling looked at the chopsticks he had just used and thought for a moment before putting them down. She was about to pick up a new pair of chopsticks when she hesitated. There weren't many pieces left, and there seemed to be no need to specially pick up a new pair of chopsticks. Furthermore, Boss was the one who did not care about trifles. She also saw herself as a man. There was no need to be so fussy. Thus, she picked up the chopsticks again. As she ate, she picked up the prawns on the grill and placed them on the plate in front of him. This time, Li Nanheng did not refuse and went to peel the prawns. Just as Ling finished the meat on the plate and was about to put down the plate, suddenly, several peeled prawns were thrown over and landed right in the middle of the plate. "Eat these too." After saying that, the man got up and went to find water to extinguish the burning charcoal in the stove. Ling did not speak. She watched as the man stood up to tidy up the grill and silently ate the prawns. Seeing that she obediently sat there to eat, Li Nanheng was in a good mood and actually began to work. He took out the oven that was extinguished and cooled not long after, and then went to clean up the things on the ground. Seeing that Boss actually took the initiative to help her, Ling silently stood up again to help clean up. When the tent was cleaned up and Li Nanheng walked in again, Ling realized a very serious problem. "Boss, are you going to stay on this snowy mountain tonight?" Li Nanheng casually brushed the snow off his body and coldly glanced at her as if she was talking nonsense. Ling immediately glanced at the tent next door. "It's warmer in a tent with more people. Try to squeeze a little more. There should be a bed. I'll go tell them to prepare a quilt for you." With that, Ling walked out. Li Nanheng coldly glanced at her. "Don't you have a seat in this tent?" Sure enough, he still couldn't avoid staying in her place. Ling looked at the suitcase under the bed worriedly. "Then boss, I'll go get you a foldable bed," Ling said, and was about to go out again. "Moving those things on your bed will save you more energy than running to find a foldable bed. Can't 2 people sleep on a bed that is 1.5 meters wide?" Ling suddenly paused. In a blink of an eye, she saw that Li Nanheng had walked to the bedside and was about to move the things she piled up on the bedside. Her heart skipped a beat. The breast-binding cloth was in the suitcase, but among the things she put on the bedside, there seemed to be a sanitary pad in it. "Boss." Ling suddenly rushed forward, and held the things on the bed in her arms. "I'll collect my things myself. Boss, stand by the side and wait for a while. I'll put them away soon." Seeing her rare initiative and enthusiasm, Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and took a step back. Ling carried the things off the bed and placed them on the table. She secretly scolded herself for not putting the sanitary pads under the bed. The others were all careless and wouldn't notice anything, let alone touch her things. However, she didn't expect that Boss Li would suddenly come and even stay here. He would even sleep on her bed. She didn't even have the time to refuse to sleep on the same bed when her attention was diverted. After putting the things away, she looked up and saw that Li Nanheng had sat on the bed and casually taken off his coat. Ling lowered her head with a headache and raised her hand to rub her forehead. "Headache? Uncomfortable?" The man's voice suddenly rang. She abruptly put down her hand. "No, my forehead was a little itchy just now, so I scratched it." With that, she stood up. Because she had to go back and forth to deliver the things outside the tent, she was still wearing the thick winter clothes, and her movements were a little clumsy. She turned to see that Li Nanheng had already taken off his clothes and was only wearing a black t-shirt. His slim and shapely waist under the t-shirt made her feel like committing a crime. Ling turned her eyes away and looked outside. I heard from Fat Tai that although this place is cold, the ground is covered with snow. It's easy to melt the snow into water and then put it on the water to take a shower, so it doesn't affect your washing. I've been on the road for a whole day. You don't mind if I take a shower here, do you? Even though the man said so, he had already stood up and walked to the corner of the tent that was separated from the rest. There was a simple bathroom. Because it was for Feng Ling's own use, she made it very clean, and there were all kinds of toiletries. The man walked in and could vaguely smell the faint fragrance of shower gel, which was very similar to the smell on Feng Ling's body. He took off his shirt and walked out to find a towel, only to see that Feng Ling was lying on the ground by the bed and was about to touch the suitcase under the bed. She seemed very anxious and strained. Chapter 879. Feng Ling was surprised and turned to see the man who took off his shirt and came out. She thought he was going to take a shower and wouldn't come out in a short time. She quickly moved her hand away from the suitcase, glanced at the man's naked upper body, coughed, and said, "Boss, I'm looking for clothes for you to change into." "No, I brought some." The man turned around and walked to the table. He picked up a black bag with unknown contents and took out a new t-shirt and a pair of loose and comfortable shorts from it. Feng Ling's eyelids twitched. It turned out that the bag he took down when he asked Fat Tai and the others to get the oven was filled with clothes for him to change into. "Boss." She slowly stood up by the bed, stared at the clothes in his hand, and asked, "Didn't you only stay here for one night? How long do you plan to stay here?" Li Nanheng walked towards a bathroom and said indifferently, "After I sent you here, the U.S. military informed me that there are a lot of mafia members stationed nearby. Although there are no movements, I came to accompany you for a while in case you really encounter any danger." With that, the man didn't explain more and went straight into her simple, small bathroom. "I came to accompany you for a while. That was to say, how long he would stay here depended on his mood. It could be as short as 2 or 3 days, or as long as 2 or 3 months. Feng Ling secretly took a deep breath and then looked at the bed beside her that could really sleep 2 people, and her eyelids twitched again. If Boss really planned to stay here for a while, she had to find a way to get a folding bed. Otherwise, it was really not safe to sleep in the same bed like this. After all, she had learned a lesson from the past. She went to his room to deliver wine. He was clearly sober, but he could still do that to her. If they continued to stay here, even if Boss Li was not a lecherous man in Feng Ling's eyes, something would definitely happen. She couldn't live with the other 7 people. Otherwise, it would be easy for them to find out that she was different, but if she lived with Boss, it would be more dangerous. Right now, they couldn't move to another place to live, but they also couldn't blatantly force their boss to live there. Feng Ling leaned down again tiredly, but she didn't dare to take the suitcase away, because Boss Li should have noticed her movements just now. When he came out again, if he saw that the suitcase had been moved, it would definitely arouse a suspicion, so she might as well put it down. Even if he wanted to put on the chest wrapping cloth, he would have to wait until tomorrow when he left the tent. She glanced at her winter clothes again and stood by the bed in a daze for a while. Hearing the sound of water coming from the simple bathroom, she instantly remembered what Li Nanheng said that day. "What do you think I'm going to do in the bathroom?" Feng Ling's ears suddenly turned hot. She turned and walked out. After running 4 or 5 laps outside the tent, she sat in the white snow, leaned back and lay in the snow, looking at the stars in the sky. Although it was located on the border of Montana, although there were many cliffs and cliffs here, although it was very, very cold, it was still under the same sky. Whether it was in Los Angeles or here, the stars at night would not change. She lay for a long time, but the coldness made it impossible for her to fall asleep. Feng Ling just looked at the white breath she exhaled and didn't move, until she heard the creaking sound of walking, which was the sound of people walking in this place she had been used to these days. Before she turned her face, she saw that Li Nanheng had come into her sight. The man had taken a shower and changed his clothes. He was only wearing a slightly thick black uniform and did not wear winter clothes. With his hands in his trouser pockets, he stepped on the snow and walked to her side, looking down at the boy lying on the ground. "What? Do you think I occupied your bed? Are you going to use the sky as your bed?" Foam Ling abruptly sat up and patted the snow off her sleeves and legs. Then she hugged her heavy clothes and struggled to stand up from the ground. She shook off the snow on her body and looked up at him. "Boss, are you done showering?" Li Nanheng glanced at her. "And aren't you going in to take a shower?" "I won't wash it. Rogers Pass is not as good as the base. Even if there is no shortage of water and it's convenient to take a bath, it's too extravagant to take a bath 2 or 3 times a day. Besides, you won't sweat in such a place, and you're always clean and refreshed. It's okay if you don't take a bath once or twice." Li Nanheng watched as the little black bear stumbled to the entrance of the tent and walked in with a muffled voice. He smiled and confirmed that Foam Ling really didn't plan to bathe tonight. Without saying anything, he turned and walked back. The temperature in the tent was quite warm. Li Nanheng took off his black combat suit jacket and lay down on the bed, wearing only a short-sleeved black t-shirt and shorts. After lying down, he tried the softness and hardness of the bed under him. It was not bad. For comfort and cold resistance, the bed was quite thick, and it was very comfortable to lie on. "Do you sleep outside or inside?" The man rested his head on his arms and looked very comfortable. He glanced at Foam Ling, who was still standing by the door like a bear. "Ah!" At first, Foam Ling thought he was referring to the outside or inside of the tent. She was about to speak when she realized that he was referring to the outside or inside of the bed. She glanced at the bed. "I'll sleep outside. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll disturb boss's rest when I wake up at night." Li Nanheng shifted his body into the bed. However, the man was tall and had long legs. The 1.5 meter by 1.8 meter wide bed seemed a little small under him. Fortunately, there was a table at the end of the bed. Otherwise, he would have no place to put his feet when lying on it. "It's late. Go to bed early." The man rested his head on his arms and said lightly. Then he closed his eyes. He had been on the road for a whole day, so he must be tired. Foam Ling didn't say anything but walked inside. Although she didn't take a bath, she took off her winter clothes and went in to wash her face and brush her teeth. When she came out of the bathroom, she put on the thick winter clothes again. She saw that Boss Lee had been sleeping quietly on the bed for a while and didn't move for a long time. She didn't know whether he was asleep or not. When she and Kay went out on a mission, they lay in a mud ditch together for a night and heard Kay's earth-shattering snoring, but Boss Lee didn't have that kind of annoying snoring sound when he slept. Chapter 880. As soon as she covered him with the quilt, the man said with his eyes closed, "Why aren't you sleeping?" Foam Ling paused. "I'm going to sleep right away." Li Nanheng opened his eyes, glanced at her, and then at the quilt she had just covered him with. He smiled faintly and said lightly, "Sleep early." Foam Ling grunted and lay down. Li Nanheng vaguely heard the sound of clothes rubbing against the bed. He frowned and opened his eyes to look at her, only to see that she was lying down in her winter clothes. "You're going to sleep without taking off your clothes?" Foam Ling had already laid on the pillow. She tidied up her bulky clothes and answered in a lying position. "Well, I may have caught a cold these days. I'm a little afraid of the cold, and it will be very cold in the middle of the night. Boss, you can sleep with the quilt. I'll sleep like this." "You're afraid of the cold? Why did you lie in the snow for so long?" "I just went out to get some fresh air. When I was tired, I lay down. Anyway, the clothes are very thick, and the temperature of the snow won't penetrate the clothes. It doesn't affect me lying in the snow," Foam Ling explained indifferently. Li Nanheng looked at the thick clothes on her and said coldly, "Take off your clothes." Foam Ling pretended not to hear him, closed her eyes, and fell asleep. "I told you to take off your clothes and pretend to be deaf, En?" The man's tone was obviously displeased. Foam Ling had to open her eyes. "Boss, I'm really afraid of the cold." "If you're afraid of the cold, cover yourself with a quilt. Who wears such thick clothes to sleep? Don't you feel uncomfortable?" "It's not uncomfortable. It's okay. I'm used to it. I've slept like this occasionally these days." Li Nanheng didn't speak anymore but turned over and faced her. He crossed his arms over his chest and stared at her. Foam Ling remained lying flat. Anyway, she couldn't take off her clothes. She didn't wrap her chest cloth inside. If she took it off and lay next to him like this, if he made any other movements, he would easily see through her. Even if she wanted to take it off, she had to wait until she wrapped the chest cloth around her body tomorrow. She pretended not to see the man who had turned sideways and lay flat with her eyes closed. "Are you sure you want to sleep like this?" "Yeah, I'm sure." Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "Why are you wearing so many layers? Are you afraid that I will touch you, or do you feel insecure sleeping in the same bed with me? Do you have to wear so many layers of clothes to feel comfortable?" "Boss, I'm just afraid of the cold," Foam Ling insisted and did not explain further. "If you're afraid of the cold, then you haven't done enough cold resistance training." Li Nanheng snorted. "And maybe." Foam Ling didn't want to say more.
Boss Li was a smart man.
She was afraid that the more she said, the more mistakes she would make. Seeing that she was going to sleep with her eyes closed, Li Nanheng didn't speak anymore. He turned back to lie flat and closed his eyes, but he still said coldly, "Whatever." Foam Ling heaved a sigh of relief in her heart and did not speak again. It was extremely quiet in the tent. Wearing such a thick winter suit was indeed uncomfortable, not to mention whether it was hot or cold, but with such a thick suit, it was difficult for her to even turn over when she was sleeping. If she turned over too loudly, it would definitely disturb the people next to her. Halfway through her sleep, she woke up with a start because she couldn't turn over. She then closed her eyes and continued to sleep. However, this time, she suddenly heard some movements. Foam Ling opened her eyes vigilantly. Before he could react, he suddenly felt a pain in his waist and he was kicked off the bed. Her clothes were thick, so she didn't feel any pain when she fell to the ground, but she was still shocked. When she realized who had kicked her, she staggered to stand up and looked at the man who was still lying calmly on the bed.
"Boss."
Li Nanheng closed his eyes and said flatly, "It's too crowded." Foam Ling's brows twitched. She glanced at the bed under him. Her clothes did take up a lot of space, but even if it was a little crowded, it was too much to kick her off the bed. She didn't speak, but pressed her coat hard. Anyway, this kind of winter clothes looked bulging, but as long as she pressed it, it would be flatter and save a lot of space. After pressing it, she lay back on the bed and said aggrievedly, "Boss, don't kick me anymore." The man didn't respond and seemed to be asleep again. She closed her eyes and continued to sleep. However, less than 5 minutes later, with a thud, Foam Ling was kicked off the bed again. Foam Ling, who was lying on the ground. She was angry but didn't want to provoke him, so she didn't say anything. She reached out to take the pillow off the bed and lay on the ground to continue sleeping. Anyway, the clothes were very thick, so it didn't matter if she lay on the ground. This time, the man finally sat up. He lowered his eyes to look at Foam Ling, who was lying on the bed calmly, as though she was going to deal with whatever came her way. Sensing the man's gaze, Foam Ling opened her eyes on the ground and looked into his eyes. "Is it comfortable lying on the ground?" "It's okay. The clothes are thick. I don't feel anything." "Well, I plan to ask you to bring in another folding bed tomorrow night. It seems that there's no need to be so troublesome. In the future, as long as I'm here for a day, I'll sleep on the bed and you'll sleep on the ground." Foam Ling was silent for a moment and then sat up. She raised her hand and scratched her messy hair. "Boss, do you have to be so mean to me? It's just a sleep." Li Nanheng was expressionless. "Indeed, it's just a sleep. Do you have to be so careful that you can't even take off your outermost winter clothes?" Foam Ling was speechless. She pursed her lips and suddenly stood up from the ground. "Forget it, I won't sleep." "Boss, you sleep by yourself." Li Nanheng looked at her angry expression and was about to speak when he saw Foam Ling casually pick up a folded military chair, bring it to the entrance of the tent, and put it down against the door. Then she sat on the chair and didn't move. It seemed that she didn't want to sleep and planned to keep vigil for him. Li Nanheng looked at her messy little head and then at her angry face, and his brows moved. He just wanted Foam Ling to take off her clothes and sleep. Even if she didn't need to take off all her clothes, she didn't need to wear such thick clothes. The clothes were so big on her body that she would suffocate to death if she didn't pay attention. It was clearly for her own good. Why was Foam Ling so angry? "You're not going to sleep?" He looked in that direction and asked. Foam Ling didn't speak but pulled the hat up again and put it on her head, looking as though she didn't hear him and didn't feel annoyed. From the looks of it, she was really angry. Li Nanheng couldn't help glancing at the ground under the bed. Chapter 881. In the dead of night, one was lying on the bed, and the other was sitting on the chair, and no one spoke. No matter what Li Nanheng said, Foam Ling ignored him. In the end, the man didn't say anything, and let her continue to sit there. However, in the middle of the night, Li Nanheng opened his eyes and saw that Foam Ling, who had been sitting there for a long time, had not moved. He guessed that she must have fallen asleep on the chair. Li Nanheng got up, got out of bed, walked over slowly, and came to the chair. He looked down at Foam Ling, who had fallen asleep with her eyes closed for a while, and then looked at her heavy clothes and the big hat on her head. With Foam Ling's vigilance, if he carried her to the bed now, she would definitely wake up. But looking at her sleeping posture, even if she could fall asleep, her neck would probably be sore tomorrow morning. Li Nanheng sighed, turned back to the bed, picked up the pillow, came over, gently held her head forward, and then put the soft pillow behind her neck and on the back of the chair. After making sure that she could sleep more comfortably, he stopped. Although the arrival of Boss Lee brought them good food, their physical slack finally ended. Early the next morning, in the first training session after coming to Rogers Pass, the group of people was so cold that their faces and noses turned red. The point was that they were not allowed to wear cold-proof clothes, including Foam Ling. According to Boss Lee's request, it was to prevent their physique from causing diseases in the low-temperature environment if they lived in such a place for a long time, so they must strengthen cold resistance training every day. The first day of training was only to take off the cold-proof clothes and stand in the snow in the wind and snow wearing the down jacket inside. On the second day of training, they had to take off the down jacket until they could stand in the wind and snow in the vest for an hour. This kind of inhuman cold training was done in every country's army, but 11 Base was located in a hot place in Los Angeles, and they had not been exposed to such an extremely cold area for many years, so they were not well trained in cold resistance training. What Boss Lee meant was that since the conditions of this place were so good, they could do cold resistance training. The group of people grumbled in their hearts, but they didn't dare to say a single word. After all, there was meat to eat by following their boss. If they really got frostbite, their boss would definitely take responsibility. They didn't have to worry at all. After 3 days of cold-resistant training, although at the beginning, everyone was covered in tears and snot, and their eyelashes were covered in a thick layer of frost, but after 3 days, they didn't even need to wear winter clothes when they walked out of the tent, and they were no longer as afraid of the cold as when they first arrived. After 3 days of training, Li Nanheng was not as devilish as he was in the base, so they could rest for the next 2 days. Taking advantage of the 2 days of rest, everyone insisted on finding a river to catch fish. De Bin had lived in the north since he was young. He described the fish caught from the river under the ice as having a lot of thick and delicious meat. This group of people was extremely greedy. Since they had nothing to do, they still wanted to find it. Foam Ling didn't want to go, but Li Nanheng was dragged away by the 7 people. Before he left, he also dragged her with him. Since Boss had gone, it wouldn't be right if she didn't go, so she had to follow a group of people to find a river to look for food. In fact, in addition to glaciers, there were many rivers around the Rogers Pass, but a few days ago, when they came down to look for it, they went in the wrong direction. This time, they directly brought an electronic map and a compass, found the location of the river, and began to study how to cut through the thick ice. The ice was much thicker than the ice on the mountain. They didn't have professional tools to cut through the ice, and the method of using salt to melt the ice was not particularly useful and time-consuming. But fortunately, there were many of them. In 2s and 3s, they took turns to find a fixed place on the river and began to dig. About 2 hours later, the thick ice was cut a lot. Lying on the surface and listening carefully, they could vaguely hear the sound of the river below. Continue. Continue. We'll be able to catch fish soon. Fat Tai was very excited. Hearing the sound of water, He picked up the tool and stood on it to continue to dig. Be careful. The layer of ice around here has already cracked a few places because we've used too much strength. If you continue to smash down like this, it'll be dangerous if other places suddenly crack before this piece is broken. Someone beside him reminded him. It's okay. The ice is so thick. We haven't broken it for a long time. If it can really crack so easily, well, as Fatai spoke, he ferociously poked the tool into the ice hole again. The moment he finally poked it open, before he could even rejoice, the ice under his feet, which already showed signs of cracking, shook, and his fat body instantly fell into the cracked ice hole. Help. Be careful. A group of people rushed over, but the moment they rushed over, they found that the surrounding ice had already cracked. If they all rushed over, it was possible that the whole piece of ice would fall down. Fatty's body had already been immersed in the ice water, and his 2 hands grasped the ice beside him tightly, shouting for help. Just when they hesitated for less than 5 seconds, Fatty's hands could no longer hold the ice. With a cry of despair, his hands slipped down. Fatai. Foamling saw that it was too late and was about to rush over, but someone moved faster than her and held Fatty's hand. Boss, save me. Fatai was so scared that his tears almost fell out. He raised his eyes and saw that the person who suddenly rushed over was Nanheng. He immediately cried out as if he had seen his biggest savior. Boss, I don't want to freeze to death here. Boss, save me. Shut up. Nanheng's expression was ugly. Fatty's weight was not something an ordinary person could bear. Furthermore, he was only using the strength of his wrist. He furrowed his brows and turned back to shout at the others who rushed over. Don't come over. If there are too many people, the ice will crack. Hold me from the back. All right. Foam Ling followed the others and pulled them from the back with all her strength. However, her eyes were fixed on Nanheng's wrist that was forcefully holding onto Fatty's wrist. Less than half a month ago, his ligament had been strained. The doctor had specially said that he couldn't use any strength in a short period of time. But now, not only was he using strength, but he was also holding onto Fatty's hand with all his might. Fatty's weight was close to 280 kilograms. Foam Ling's eyes trembled. Among the group, she was the lightest. It shouldn't be a problem to add her weight to the ice. She suddenly let go of his hand and rushed over. Chapter 882. The moment she rushed over, Foam Ling fell forward and grabbed Li Nanheng's wrist without hesitation. Boss, your hand. Li Nanheng saw that she had rushed over and immediately furrowed his brows. What are you doing here? Go to the back. Foam Ling did not speak. She gripped his wrists tightly with both hands to reduce the damage to his wrists caused by Fatty's heavy weight. Li Nanheng glanced at Foam Ling's actions and furrowed his brows again. He held Fatty's hand with one hand and raised his other to shove her away. Scram to the back. I'm the lightest here. There's not much difference even if you add my weight. Foam Ling stubbornly held onto his wrist. Boss, move your hand away. I'll pull him up with you. You can't use too much strength alone. Otherwise, your hand will really be crippled in the future. Boss. Fatty's body was mostly submerged in the water. He was cold and afraid, and his face was pale from the cold. The others were still exerting strength from the back. However, the ice surface was extremely slippery. Due to their unstable footing, they could only exert a small amount of strength. Foam Ling held Li Nanheng's wrist and continued to pull him up until Fatty's upper body was out. However, he was already frozen stiff and could not climb out on his own. He could only rely on everyone's strength to pull him out. From start to finish, it took a total of 10 minutes. Fatai was finally completely pulled out of the crack in the ice. His fat body was dragged to the side. His body was extremely cold, but his eyes were filled with tears after escaping death. He panted heavily and said, "Thank you, boss, you scared me to death." Dabin and the others were about to come over to check on Li Nanheng's hand. However, seeing that Foam Ling was still by boss's side, they did not go over. They turned to look at Fat Tai, who was lying on the ice, and rushed over. They wrapped their winter coats tightly around Fatty's body. The others also did the same. After all, Fatty's entire body was soaked in water. If he continued to freeze like this, even if he did not fall into the water, he would most likely freeze to death on the way back. "How's your wrist? Did you injure yourself again?" Foam Ling stood by Li Nanheng's side. Seeing that his hand was hanging by his side, she reached out to pull his hand up and at the same time pressed his wrist a few times. Sure enough, she saw that the man's originally expressionless face had a trace of whiteness. Li Nanheng glanced at her with a dark expression and was about to withdraw his hand, but Foam Ling held him tightly. "Boss, your wrist won't do. Get to Bin and the others to drive you back to Montana and find a hospital. Or get Doctor when to fly over to Montana." As Foam Ling spoke, she used her 2 hands to hold his wrist tightly to help warm his wrist joints. She definitely couldn't let the already strained area suffer any coldness again. "It's not as serious as you think." Li Nanheng calmly looked at the pair of small hands on his wrist that were slightly red from the cold. His expression did not change as he coldly said, "Move your hands away. I'm going to check on Fat Tai. Fat Tai has to bin, and the rest." Foam Ling also turned to look. Seeing that they had already lifted Fat Tai, who was lying on the ground, she finally retracted her gaze to look at him. "Let's go back first." Li Nanheng did not speak more. He directly turned to leave. Unexpectedly, when he turned, Foam Ling did not release his wrist. She simply turned in a circle, still holding onto his wrist tightly. He glanced at her again, his gaze so dark that it seemed boundless. Foam Ling was still focused on his wrist. Even as they walked back, she carefully protected his wrist. As they walked, she tugged out a section of her wide and long sleeve and wrapped it around his wrist. Then, she hid both their hands in her wide sleeve. She kept holding onto him tightly as they walked back. If it weren't for the fact that Boss's wrist had been injured previously, Foam Ling would have thought that the two of them were secretly holding hands under their sleeves. This scene was harmonious no matter how one looked at it. However, Fat Tai was so cold that he was grimacing in pain. This scene was harmonious no matter how one looked at it, but Fat Tai was grimacing in cold. As he was being carried away, he said with a face full of pain, "After chiseling the ice for so long, I finally broke it, but not only did I not catch a single fish, I almost threw myself into the ice to feed the fish. Am I going to become paralyzed from the cold just like that? Right now, aside from the cold, I can't feel anything. I seem to be very numb. Am I crippled?" "Shut up. Who gave you the courage to bring your nearly 300 kilograms of fat to the edge of the ice that was about to split open? If it were anyone else standing on it, they might not be able to do such a thing." The brothers mocked him but still carefully carried him all the way into the tent. Then, they stripped Fat Tai clean from head to toe, wrapped the electric blanket around him, and wiped his limbs with a towel dipped in hot water. The group of men busied themselves, but they knew that at this time, with Boss by Foam Ling's side, they could not interfere, so they could only work around this pig. On the other side, Foam Ling pushed Li Nanheng into the tent. She directly dragged him to the bed and sat him down. Then she turned around to search for a long time. She remembered that the things they brought were only some daily cold medicine, anti-inflammatory medicine, and some frostbite ointment. There was no other medicine for injuries and this kind of auxiliary medicine that could be used to massage and treat joints. Li Nanheng sat by the bed. His wrist was indeed very painful, but the situation was urgent. Even if he really had to cripple this hand, he could not watch as something happened to his men. He watched as Foam Ling anxiously rummaged through the things here. Seeing that she had lost her composure and was so anxious because of him, he didn't say anything and just sat by the bed to watch her. "There's no medicine." Foam Ling walked back. Her expression was not very good. "I'll call the base right now and have them send a helicopter over to pick you up. There's no need. I've said it before." "It's not that serious," Li Nanheng interrupted her. "It's been a while since I pulled my ligaments. Cold compresses are useless now, so I can only apply hot compresses. The effect of hot compresses is similar to applying medicine and massaging, but it will take a longer time. Bring me a hot towel and the knee pad that Dabin wore today. Wrap it around my wrist. I'll be fine after resting for a while. It's not that troublesome. Chapter 883. Will this really work? She didn't really believe his words. Lee Nanheng glanced at her coldly. It's my wrist. How can I endure the pain? Just do what I tell you to do. Why are you talking so much nonsense? Fengling. Oh. He was right. He couldn't possibly allow his wrist to be crippled just like that. She quickly went to get a hot towel for him, and then went to find Dabin to ask for the knee pad that automatically heated up. She didn't know where it came from. To her surprise, the knee pad really could heat up when placed in her hands. Fengling studied it for a while and found that there was a hidden button with a battery inside. No wonder it could heat up. After taking it back, she wrapped the towel around Lee Nanheng's wrist and then wrapped the knee pad that automatically heated up outside the towel. She made sure that the towel would always maintain a suitable temperature. Not only could it be used as a hot compress, but it could also be used to fix his wrist in place to prevent the ligaments from pulling and injuring him again. Lee Nanheng's wrist was seriously injured. In addition, although Fatty's life was saved, he had a serious cold and was bedridden the entire day. He had a fever and coughed, causing the people in the 2 tents to be extremely busy. Especially when it was time to eat, they all came out to help each other, thinking of ways to make porridge and other light dishes. Lee Nanheng was not as troublesome as Fatai. Although it was his right hand that was injured, every time it was mealtime, Fengling would take the initiative to come over. She would either give him a spoon so that it would be more convenient for him to eat, or she would simply help him pick up food and place it in his bowl in front of him. In the beginning, Lee Nanheng said that he didn't need her, but after he got used to it, he didn't even need a spoon and waited for her to feed him. Fengling saw that his wrist was indeed in so much pain that he couldn't move. Although she felt that it was inappropriate, she still fed him. She treated him as a child in his 20s and fed him. As time went by, Lee Nanheng even needed her help to put on and take off his coat. Throughout the day, aside from going to the toilet, Fengling helped him with almost everything else. Night fell again. Because of his wrist injury last night, Lee Nanheng didn't take a shower. Obviously, he couldn't take a shower tonight either. Earlier, Fengling went to the tent next door to check on Fatai. Fatty's fever had subsided, but he was still extremely weak. After soaking in the cold water for so long and being frightened badly, it was likely that he would fall ill again. The other brothers were all watching over him day and night. After confirming that there were no major problems, Fengling returned to the tent here. As soon as she came back, she saw Lee Nanheng unbuttoning his clothes with one hand and walking to the bathroom wearing only a t-shirt. Fengling looked at his back in confusion and called out, "Boss, why are you going to the bathroom? It's not convenient for you to take a bath now. Can't you wash your hair without bathing?" Lee Nanheng had always been a neat freak. He could tolerate not showering for a day or two, but not washing his hair was really uncomfortable. Fengling followed him to the bathroom door and watched as he buried his head in the sink next to the simple bathroom. He turned on the faucet of the makeshift water pipe with one hand and poured water on his hair with the other. "You're just going to wash it like that? What else?" Because he was bending over, his voice was deeper. It was a little guttural and a little hoarse. He closed his eyes and bent down to the sink. It seemed like he was struggling, but he still insisted on washing. Fengling watched for a while. Lee Nanheng was pouring water on his head when he heard Fengling's footsteps. In the next second, a pair of hands suddenly appeared in the water. She pulled his uninjured hand away and poured some warm water on his hair. He paused for a moment and turned to look at her while he was still bent over. Fengling's voice was extremely natural. "It's inconvenient for you. Let me do it." Lee Nanheng did not speak. The hand that was about to wash his hair paused in the air and slowly landed on the sink. He placed it on it and did not move again. Although Fengling was usually nimble, and although she was thinner than the others, she was definitely a violent person when she trained. But at this moment, her movements were very light. She poured water on his hair and then rubbed it gently. "You're right." Seeing that his hair was almost wet, she turned off the tap and went to the side to get some shampoo. Boss, my shampoo is not as good as the one you used in the base. Do you mind? He paused and did not forget to say with his eyes closed, I used it here when I took a shower the night before yesterday. Do I look like someone who would mind this kind of thing? Foam Ling rolled her eyes in a direction where he could not see. Of course, she didn't know whether he was this kind of person or not, but who knew if he would dislike other people's toiletries. She did not say anything, squeezed out the shampoo, rubbed it in her palm, and then rubbed it on his hair. In this simple and narrow tent, in the bathroom, under the dim yellow light, the tall and straight man bent down motionlessly, as if he had never been a tough man in front of her before. She stood by his side and carefully washed his hair, her movements light and slow, slightly jerky. However, Foam Ling, who had been trying her best to wash his hair and didn't like to make him feel uncomfortable, had no idea what kind of torture and psychological challenge Li Nanheng was suffering at this moment. The man closed his eyes and lost his vision. In the darkness, all his senses became more acute. He leaned over the sink and felt her soft hands gently rubbing his hair. Occasionally, she scratched it. It did not hurt or itch, but it seemed to ignite something silently. Her fingertip fell on the side of her ear, like a small flame. She pressed his scalp, and every touch made his sensitive body tingle. She turned on the tap and began to pour water on his head again, asking as she poured, Is the water temperature suitable? Is it hot? The water temperature was very suitable. It was warm and not hot at all. However, as the water slid down his hair and neck, it began to burn. Foam Ling rubbed his hair back and forth, her fingers gently brushing the foam by his ear, and then she combed the hair on his neck. Li Nanheng stood there calmly, but it was as if someone had ignited a flame in his chest, one after another, unable to be extinguished. After washing for a while, until the foam on his hair and neck were all washed away, Foam Ling picked up a towel and wiped his hair for him. It's done. Chapter 884. Hearing this, Foam Ling leaned over to take a closer look. Sure enough, she saw that there were water stains on the front of his t-shirt. Earlier, he had been bending over to wash his hair. In addition, she had been pouring water for him, so she didn't notice that some water had flowed down his neck and into his clothes. Foam Ling did not suspect anything. Sorry, I didn't pay much attention. Let me help you wipe it. Only then did Li Nanheng stand up. The moment he straightened his back, his gaze landed on her face. Foam Ling seriously took a dry towel from the side and wiped it on his chest. Then she looked at the remaining water stains and said apologetically, Take it off and wash it. Don't you still have a change of clothes? I'll bring it over for you. Put it on first. The man stood there without moving. He only moved his lips. And help me take it off. Foam Ling's hand paused. If it weren't for the fact that he really couldn't move his wrist, she would have suspected that he was deliberately blackmailing her. If you don't want to take it off, forget it. I'll do it myself. Without waiting for her response, Li Nanheng expressionlessly pushed her away. Don't move. Let me do it. Foam Ling had no choice. She put down the towel, reached out, and tugged the man's shirt from his belt. Then she stood in front of him and almost pressed her entire body into his arms. She wrapped her arms around him and rolled up his shirt bit by bit. Then she closed her eyes and decided to go all out. In for a penny, in for a pound, in for a pound, in for a pound. After helping him take off his shirt from his head, she watched as the man casually shook his hair because he had just washed his hair. Her gaze faltered, and she abruptly turned to walk out. She went to find his change of clothes. It was still the tight-fitting t-shirt that he usually wore inside, but this one was dark gray. Usually he wore black and occasionally he wore a white singlet. Perhaps it was because she rarely entered his room. She didn't see him wearing other colors often. Foam Ling brought the clothes in and saw that the man was standing there, bare-chested, waiting for her. It was as though waiting for her to serve him was a matter of course. She walked in and was about to hand the clothes to him when she saw the thing wrapped around the man's wrist. In the end, she walked over and helped him put on the clothes. The action of putting on clothes was the opposite of the action of taking off clothes just now. One was lifting up, while the other was gently pulling down. But basically, she was almost leaning into the man's embrace. After finally helping him put on his clothes, Fengling was about to step back, but she didn't expect that the man in front of her had been lowering his head to look at her. Just as she was about to step back, he suddenly took a step forward. She subconsciously took another step back, and the man took another step forward until her back was against the corner of the simple bathroom door. At the moment when there was no way to retreat, the scene that happened in his room that night caused Fengling's entire body to tense up. She rushed to avoid it, but the man leaned over as though he wanted to kiss her. She immediately turned her face away, and the man's lips only gently brushed against her ear. Li Nanheng lowered his head to watch her turn her head away. He gazed deeply at her and did not continue to do anything else. She raised her hand, thought for a moment, and pushed his waist. "Boss, if you can't stand properly, I'll help you out." With that, she lowered her head, pretending not to see the heavy darkness in his eyes, and raised her hand to support him. The man lowered his eyes to watch her expression. For a moment, he really wanted to kiss her, but considering that his wrist was injured, he still needed her to take care of him. If he really angered her and she raised a gun at him in a rage, he might not be able to move her hand for a while. After all, one hand could not compare to two hands. No matter how thin Fengling was, her physical strength was trained by him. He knew very well whether she had the strength or not. He straightened up and did not continue to force her down. When Fengling was free, she helped him out. When she walked to the bedside, she suddenly remembered that he could not use any strength in his wrist. It was not like his leg was injured. Why should she help him? She abruptly withdrew her hand and raised her eyes to see the man sitting by the bedside looking at her with a faint smile. Fengling immediately looked away. "Boss, you rest first. I'll go to see Fat Tai. Didn't you just go to see him? You're going to see him again?" Yes, I just want to see him." Seeing that she stood by the bedside and did not know what to do next, Li Nanheng did not say more. He raised his uninjured hand and casually tugged at his hair. He then said lightly, "Do you remember how Enriching massaged me at the entrance of the infirmary last time?" Fengling recalled. "I roughly remember." It seemed that it was mainly a simple action to promote blood circulation. It could not be too heavy or too light. She gently massaged the area where the ligaments were strained. "Then give it a try," the man said and raised his hand. "Fengling, you want me to massage you?" Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows. "This can speed up the recovery. Otherwise, when do you want to keep feeding me, washing my hair, and changing my clothes? If this continues, I'm afraid I'll have to accompany you to the toilet from tomorrow onwards." Fengling was silent for a moment before walking over and helping him untie the things on his wrist. She then looked at the man's wrist, which was slightly pale from being hot compressed for a day. There was no medicine or doctor. She didn't know if such a simple hot compress would work. However, seeing that he wasn't anxious or worried, she didn't say much. She only raised her hand. At first, she was still a little unfamiliar and rubbed his wrist for a while. At first, Li Nanheng seemed to be in some pain, but he did not say anything and allowed her to massage him. After 10 minutes, Fengling found the rhythm and direction of the massage. Although the expression on his face was not obvious, she could still see the pain and comfort on his wrist. She slowly massaged according to the rhythm of his comfort. Li Nanheng looked at her hand that had been massaging his wrist. After a while, he suddenly raised his other hand and pulled her to his side. "Sit down. I'm helping you. Sit down and massage." This sitting position was really too close. Fengling twisted her waist slightly and continued to massage him carefully. As she massaged, she raised her head to look at his expression from time to time. Only when she was sure that he was really comfortable did she relax. The man took advantage of her sitting position and glanced at her hair. He suddenly said, "Have you not cut your hair for a while?" Fengling's hair had indeed not been cut for a long time. She had been too busy recently and hadn't found the time to cut it. Right now, it was already longer than the length below her ears. It was indeed a little long. She responded and raised her hand to tuck her hair behind her ear. It was just a habitual action. The man watched her snow-white cheeks and soft white ears exposed because her hair was lifted, and his gaze darkened.
Dash.
Chapter 885. After sleeping in the same bed for the past 2 days, Foam Ling had more or less lost her vigilance toward Li Nanheng. As a person who rarely interacted with others, she gradually adapted to having people around her, but the only thing she adapted to was Li Nanheng's existence. The man's refreshing scent seemed to be mixed with something that made women instinctively feel safe. She didn't think too much about it, but when she was massaging him, she really didn't notice that the man next to her had been watching her. After rubbing for a while, her hands were a little sore. She helped him apply a hot compress again, and then got up to make the bed. Her movements were so natural that it was as if the two of them were an old couple who had slept together for God knows how many years. Seeing that Foam Ling seemed to be used to it and was no longer so obviously resistant to his approach, Li Nanheng smiled. He wanted to laugh, but still held back his smile. When Foam Ling turned back to look at him, the man's face had returned to indifference. Fatai lay in bed for a whole 5 days. In fact, he had woken up 2 days ago, but he had been lazing around and saying that he felt uncomfortable all over. Only on the 5th day did he become lively again. He complained that he had been eating too bland these days. He wanted to eat barbecued meat and grilled fish. He also said that he had gained experience from falling into the ice cave that day. The next time he went to do it, he would definitely not stand at the side. He would keep a certain distance and angle away from it. The group of people originally didn't intend to think about catching fish anymore. After all, it was really too dangerous that day. Coupled with Fatty's matter, they all thought that Fat Tai would be traumatized. However, who would have thought that the first thing this damn Fat Tai did after getting out of bed was to eat? In fact, a large part of the ice layer had been open that day. After working so hard for so long, they didn't catch a single fish. They were still a little unwilling, but they still didn't want to take the risk. However, not only did Fat Tai not feel traumatized, but he also took the initiative to dig the ice in the original position. The brothers discussed it together and decided to bring a rope this time to be safe. Foam Ling and Li Nanheng didn't go, but they believed that there wouldn't be any problems this time. After all, they were all trained in the base. They should have the instinct to learn from their mistakes. This time, they definitely wouldn't mess around. Sure enough, in less than 3 hours, the sound of Fat Tai and the others walking back could be heard from outside. Li Nanheng went out of the tent to smoke. Hearing the noise from afar, he narrowed his eyes and looked back. A thin layer of smoke came out of his mouth. He saw the buckets in their hands, which were filled to the brim. Clearly, they had a good harvest. Who would have thought that by stationing these kids here, they would learn another skill? Even the glaciers and snowy peaks could not starve them to death. Li Nanheng smiled and flicked the cigarette butt. He didn't go over and let them walk and dance happily and excitedly. At night, a sumptuous fish meal was unavoidable. Even Foam Ling didn't expect to be able to live a life with fish and meat in this kind of place. Even someone like her, who didn't know much about food, could feel a rare sense of happiness, not to mention how excited Fat Tai was every day. On the 10th day after the 8 people of 11 Base and Li Nanheng were stationed on Rogers Pass, someone from the base delivered the things they needed in time. On the 15th day after they were stationed at Rogers Pass, in the early morning, it was Dabin's turn to guard last night. He suddenly blew a hidden whistle that could only be heard within 30 meters. Only the people of 11 Base understood this kind of hidden whistle. It meant that the enemy was approaching and everyone should prepare immediately. Hearing the whistle, the people in the 2 tents opened their eyes almost at the same time. Even if they were sleepy, they jumped up in an instant. Within 5 minutes, they put on their clothes, hid their guns, daggers, and other weapons on their bodies, and ran out of the tent in unison. What happened? Li Nanheng walked out of the tent, glanced at the base members who were already standing in a row in front of him, and turned his eyes to Dabin. After following Li Nanheng out, Foam Ling didn't ask much, and directly joined the line in front of him. They lined up neatly, and were on standby. "Boss, there's an ambush." As Dabin spoke, He turned to look at another snowy mountain diagonally across from them. There was no one on it, but from this angle he could see a few faint footprints on it. No one would pass by this kind of place casually, and the construction team arranged by the U.S. military would not come here. Since last night, none of them had run to the opposite snow mountain. If there was really someone, if the other party wasn't lying in ambush or deliberately hiding, they wouldn't be so silent. I just got up to go to the toilet, but as soon as I walked out, I heard a very small signal flare. I immediately realized something was wrong. I looked around and saw footprints on the opposite mountain. The people of 11 Base had very keen observation skills. Even if it was far away, even if it was all white, they would still observe the surrounding terrain and situation before they went to sleep every night. Even if the footprints on the opposite mountain were not obvious, the high and low snow on the opposite mountain were already too obvious. Hearing this, Li Nanheng coldly glanced in that direction and didn't speak. He just signaled everyone to pay attention with his eyes, and then said indifferently, "The top of the snow mountain is the best place to snipe. Leave 5 people here, and be ready to fight. The rest follow me down." No one spoke. To avoid alerting the enemy, they only nodded and signaled with their eyes. Fengling was supposed to stay on the mountain, but she glanced at Li Nanheng's hand and said, "Boss, I'll go with you. Da Hu and Vite will stay." Da Hu's long-range sniping skills are also among the best in that assessment. Although he didn't enter the sniper team, he is more stable in long-range shooting than me. I don't have a long gun here, so I can't be as stable as him. Li Nanheng knew what she was thinking. He glanced at her, gave Da Hu a look, and then called Fatai Dabin to go down with him. Fengling quickly followed. The group followed a small path that they had discovered 2 days ago and descended the mountain. There was only one river under the 2 snowy mountains, and it just so happened that this river was the one that Fatai and Dabin often took a few days ago. They were already very familiar with the terrain of this river. After giving each other a look, they directly approached the opposite mountain along the edge of the cliff, which was the most suitable place for hiding. This group of people was also very shrewd. They could only be evenly matched when they stood on high ground. If they attacked from below, they would only suffer a great loss. However, if the 2 sides confronted each other across the mountain, it would not be a good thing for them. Firstly, their camp would be destroyed, and secondly, they could not completely win. Chapter 886. As expected, the moment they circled around the foot of the mountain, Fengling abruptly reached into her pocket and entered battle mode. Fatai and Dabin also entered battle mode at the same time. Li Nanheng walked at the front. The moment a figure suddenly appeared in front of them, he opened fire. The other party did not dodge in time and was shot in the shoulder. However, he still persisted in raising his gun to shoot at them. "Go!" Dabin shouted from the back. Fengling stepped forward, raised her gun, and quickly shot forward. The gangsters hiding at the foot of the mountain all retreated and did not dare to show their heads again. In the few seconds that passed, she rushed forward and grabbed Li Nanheng's right wrist. She was about to tell him that his hand was injured and ask him not to rush forward, but she saw that the man's left hand did not seem to have any problems holding the gun. Seeing that he was not affected by the injury, Fengling finally released his hand. She was about to rush forward when she suddenly saw Li Nanheng raise his hand to block her. She turned to look at him. The man expressionlessly gave her a look. Although he did not speak, she immediately understood his meaning. She nodded and took a step back. She then changed her angle and looked toward the corner at the foot of the mountain. Fatai and Dabin also cooperated and waited quietly at the back. They faced each other cautiously for about 3 to 4 minutes. Then, Dabin and Fatai abruptly rolled forward at a rapid speed. The moment the 2 figures rolled forward, the other party was about to fire in the direction of the ground. Fengling kicked toward the thick layer of snow by the side. The snow flew into the air and scattered toward the people in the corner. Taking advantage of the moment when they were blinded by the snow, Fatai and Dabin jumped up and raised their guns to shoot 2 of their heads. This time, there was no longer a corner to block them. When they charged forward, they saw that there were more than 10 people hiding below. This meant that there were quite a number of people on the top of the mountain. Fengling and Li Nanheng joined the fierce battle. Li Nanheng's right hand could not move. Feng Ling held the gun with one hand and slid the thick ice and snow under the mountain wall with the other. The cold frost and snow affected the vision of more than a dozen enemies and instantly turned the disadvantage of the unequal number of people into a state of equal strength. The sound of bullets rang incessantly from the foot of the mountain. At the same time, gunshots could be heard from the top of the mountain. It was unclear if it was the enemy or Da Hu's group who opened fire first, but from the sounds, it was clear that the battle was intense. Li Nanheng held his gun in his left hand and quickly finished off 2 people. 2 of them were even in the arms and legs of the other 2. With Fatai and Abin's cooperation, only 4 or 5 of the people hiding below were left. Seeing that their numbers were even and the enemy were injured, Fatai was about to rush forward when his feet suddenly sank. He lowered his head and saw that one of the men was still alive. He was lying on the ground covered in blood and tugging at his trousers. F***CKU. How dare you pull my leg? Fatai kicked out, raised his gun, and fired a bullet at the man. The remaining people didn't expect that the members they sent to the snow mountain to be so skilled. They looked at the people lying on the ground and inadvertently met Li Nanheng's gaze. Even if they didn't recognize him as the boss of 11 Base, they could tell that he was definitely not a good person. Those people didn't dare to fight anymore and retreated while defending themselves. Just as they turned the corner on the other side, the eyes of those people instantly became very fierce. Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes and suddenly shouted to the back, "Be careful, they have a lot of reinforcements." Sure enough, the moment the man's voice fell, they heard many people rushing in this direction from the foot of the mountain. F***CK. There are so many of them? Fatai frowned. There were a total of 9 members of 11 Base here. Just these few people could actually make the gangsters lurking here to fight against the U.S. military dispatch so many people. It seemed that they really didn't underestimate them at all and had made full preparations before coming to fight them. Just as the footsteps were about to approach, Li Nanheng suddenly looked back and turned to the river where Fatai and the others often caught fish a few days ago. His eyes darkened, and the moment he turned to rush in that direction, he said to Fatai, "Fatty, you've done a meritorious deed. When we go back, I'll reward you with 5 pounds of barbecue." Fatai was dumbfounded, but he didn't rush to ask and directly followed them in that direction. The gunshots and the group of people behind had already approached. This time, Li Nanheng didn't directly fight back. From the sound of footsteps, he could tell that there were at least 20 or 30 people coming. No matter how powerful the 4 of them were, their hands would be frozen if they held their guns for too long in this world of ice and snow. It was impossible for them to be so agile all the time. If they didn't outsmart them, they could only wait for death. When they were about to rush to the ice cave where they caught fish, Feng Ling immediately understood Boss's meaning. There was a thick layer of snow on top of the ice on this side of the river. With such a thick layer of snow covering this angle, it was impossible to see that there was such a big hole in the ice in front of them. However, they were the ones who personally dug this ice hole, so of course they knew where to start to avoid it. Otherwise, it would be very easy for them to fall in like Fatai. Fatai also understood that they were about to reach the most dangerous area. Because he often came here to catch fish these days, he was very clear about whether every step here was safe or dangerous. He said, "Boss, 1/2 meter to the right." Li Nanheng was about to fall in front of them, but because of Fatty's words, he moved 1/2 step to the right, but the people behind him couldn't see his change of route. They just raised their guns and rushed forward. Feng Ling had been in the base for so long and had gone out on so many missions, but this was the first time she saw such a funny and bizarre scene. The 20 or so people kept staring in their direction, but they couldn't hit them because their dodging ability was too strong. Not only could they not get close to them, but the ice under the snow was too slippery, so they couldn't stop steadily. After Li Nanheng led them forward for dozens of meters, he looked back and saw that the group of people fell into the ice hole one after another. Even though the people running behind found that the situation was not right and wanted to stop because there were too many people running over, the cracks near the ice hole that were not strong to begin with instantly cracked. 5 or 6 people fell into the cold water at the same time and sank into the water before they could even scream. Chapter 887. Seeing the casualties, Fatai could not help but laugh out loud. Damn it, who asked you to chase after me? A bunch of trash. I didn't expect a glutton to have such a use. The hole you spent so much time digging out actually came in handy. Debin also laughed. He raised his hand and patted Fatty's shoulder. Did you hear that? Boss said he'll reward you with 5 kilograms of barbecued meat. In such a cold place, 10 kilograms of barbecued meat is worth more than 10 kilograms of gold. Fatai chuckled and raised his eyes to look at Li Nanheng. Boss, you have to keep your word. Li Nanheng glanced at him and sneered, ignoring him. He casually tucked the gun in his hand into his waist. There's still a bunch of people waiting to be dealt with up there. I'll reward you when it's over. All right. Fatai stomped his feet in excitement.
As he stomped, he laughed.
Damn it, those idiots. They charged up just like that. They never expected a glutton's strength to be able to dig a hole in the ice that hasn't been broken for hundreds of years. Ha 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 ha, I knew it wasn't wrong to be fat. It's also not wrong to eat, ha ha ha. Seeing Fatty's smug look, Feng Ling shook her head and smiled. She put away the gun, ignored the people lying on the ground behind her, and stepped forward quickly. She glanced at Li Nanheng's left hand and then at his right hand. Although Feng Ling did not speak, Fatai and Debin immediately recalled the way Boss held the gun with his left hand. They immediately exclaimed, That's right, Boss. You're actually so good with the gun with your left hand. That's amazing. Li Nanheng was indifferent. After returning to the base, every night when everyone else has gone to rest, practice shooting with your left hand for 2 hours. In less than 3 years, you guys will be doing the same. So Boss is reminding us that even Boss Li had a period of time where he trained hard, right? As expected, geniuses are not born. They all have to rely on hard work. Fatty's expression was as though he had been fed chicken soup for his soul. His face was filled with admiration. Why can't Boss Li have a period of time where he trained hard? Although Boss is from the Li family, I heard that the elders threw Boss into the base a long time ago. At that time, Boss was probably still very young, probably even younger than Feng Ling, Debin said. Li Nanheng ignored them and glanced at Feng Ling. Don't worry. I didn't use my right hand just now. Feng Ling retracted her gaze and did not say anything. Although Feng Ling remained silent, the concern in her eyes was obvious. Li Nanheng smiled slightly and walked to another road up the mountain. Let's go back and deal with the rest. Originally, they thought that they would be able to fight back and forth for a while. Everyone was already prepared for the possibility of casualties and that it would take a long time for the fight to end. In the end, they didn't expect that this ice hole would solve a huge problem. It didn't take long for them to settle the problem. Fatai whistled as he walked in front. Debin listened as Fatai continued to whistle and brag about how much foresight he had. Debin's mouth twitched uncontrollably as he listened. He really couldn't be bothered with him. Just as the 2 people in front had walked a little further away, Li Nanheng suddenly paused. The moment Feng Ling approached him, he reached out and pushed her harshly. Feng Ling didn't expect him to suddenly push her. She stumbled and fell to the side. The moment she fell to the ground, a bullet that passed through the silencer narrowly brushed past her neck. Although it only left a trace of blood on her skin, she still felt a sharp pain, causing her to look back abruptly. She saw that among the group of people who had fallen to the ground, 2 of them had only been shot in the abdomen. They had fallen to the ground and pretended to be dead. Taking advantage of the moment when they were off guard, they charged forward again. Li Nanheng glanced at the movements of the 2 people. Without waiting for Feng Ling to react, he had already turned around to pull out his gun and charged forward. Feng Ling raised her hand to touch her neck. There was only a faint trace of blood. She glanced at the blood on her finger and coldly stood up to charge forward. Fatai and Debin heard the sound. Ah! They turned back to see the situation and immediately said, Not good. They rushed to turn back. However, at this moment, several people appeared from nowhere and successfully blocked Fatai and Debin. Feng Ling had already chased after them, But the man in black, who was still very skilled after being injured, dodged very quickly. When they chased after them again, one of them suddenly leaped over and stood in front of Feng Ling. Feng Ling faced them alone. From the corner of her eyes, she saw that Li Nanheng was chasing after the fastest person. She couldn't help but frown. No matter how skilled he was, his right wrist was still a temporary weakness. If that person found out that his right hand could not move, it would be bad. Feng Ling quickly turned to avoid the bullet. She then abruptly leaped to the side and kicked the snow off the mountain wall. She turned around and fired at the man. However, he actually dodged. On the other side, Li Nanheng saw that the man in the black suit was not only skilled, but he had clearly received professional training in ambushes. In just a few moves, the man had already begun to attack his right hand. Taking advantage of the moment when Li Nanheng's right hand dodged, the man shot the gun in his left hand onto the ground. At this critical moment, Li Nanheng knew that there were only a few bullets left in the gun. There was no point in picking it up. He only seemed to take 2 steps back. Taking advantage of the moment when the man raised the gun to attack, he kicked the gun from the ground. However, he did not place it in his hand. Instead, while the gun was in midair, he viciously kicked it forward. The butt of the gun slammed into the man's face. Taking advantage of the moment when the man closed his eyes in pain, Li Nanheng leaned forward and charged forward. He bent his left arm and viciously struck the man's abdomen. Just as the man was about to fire at his back, Li Nanheng raised his head and viciously knocked his chin. He forcefully reached out to grab the man's wrist and snatched the gun from his hand. He then sneered and glanced at him with a "Brother, I understand you." The weight of the gun was obvious. He didn't have many bullets left. The man flew into a rage out of humiliation because of his gaze. The two of them had no weapons on the ice of the river and directly engaged in a hand-to-hand fight. However, Li Nanheng's movements were fast and accurate, leaving the man with no chance to resist. However, he had just suffered a loss in the ice cave. As he retreated, he deliberately stepped on a piece of ice that had been melted by blood. He then slid back harshly. Taking advantage of the moment when Li Nanheng was about to press him down, he viciously threw him back. Li Nanheng's gaze was cold. He gripped the man's collar tightly, and the two of them instantly rolled toward the ice cave. "Boss." Feng Ling kicked the man in front of her away. In the blink of an eye, she saw that Li Nanheng and the man had lost control and rolled into the crack in the river. In the blink of an eye, the two of them fell into the huge ice cave. Seeing this, Feng Ling's heart jumped. She turned back and shot. The moment blood appeared between the man's brows, she turned and rushed over. Chapter 888. Boss. Boss. Fat Tai and Dabin shook off the pestering fellows. When they turned back to see the scene, they were so frightened that their eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. They hurriedly rushed over. Feng Ling quickly ran to the crack in the ice and abruptly fell to the ground. She stared in disbelief at the icy surface of the water. Her hands gripped the blood-stained snow tightly as she stared at the surface of the water. She saw that the surface of the water was gradually calming down. Neither Li Nanheng nor the person from earlier had come up. She abruptly reached out and used all her strength to scoop up the icy water. She did not manage to scoop up anything. Boss. Fat Tai and Dabin stood by the side. They were afraid that the layer of ice beneath Feng Ling would crack, so they did not directly step onto it. They stood 2 meters behind her and stared at the quiet ice hole. They sank into a gloomy silence. The nature of this ice hole was not like usual. If Boss was in danger, they could head up to support him at any time. However, below them was an unpredictable glacial river. Fat Tai was well aware of how cold it was. Looking at the calm surface of the water, Fatty's eyes instantly reddened. What should we do? Fat Tai suppressed the worry in his heart and turned to look at Dabin. Did you bring a rope? Tie it around my waist. I'll go down to look for Boss. I didn't bring it. Dabin furrowed his brows. They knew that they could not jump down rashly. Otherwise, they would undoubtedly die. Even if they had a rope to hold on to, they might not be able to pull themselves up, much less in such a situation. Feng Ling knelt by the ice hole and stared at the water. All of a sudden, her gaze shifted to the blobs of blood slowly floating up. She stared at the floating blood and wondered whose it was. All of a sudden, Dabin saw that Feng Ling was about to get up and rushed forward to grab her wrist. Feng Ling, don't be rash. Feng Ling did not speak, but stared at the ice hole in front of her. Looking at the blood on it, she frowned. However, just as the men who Fat Tai Dabin and Fat Tai Da had shaken off approached, Feng Ling abruptly shifted her gaze away from the water in front of her. She stared at them with reddened eyes and unexpectedly turned around. She raised her leg and kicked a body on the ground, sending it flying toward the group of men. She then abruptly swooped forward and grabbed one of the men's collar. She swung her fist viciously into his face and snatched his gun. With precise marksmanship, she killed 3 men. She then turned to look at the other 2 men with reddened eyes who were unable to hit her due to Fat Tai and Dabin's interference. Feng Ling aimed the gun in her hand at the head of one of them. When the gun was dozens of meters away, she mercilessly fired again. With 2 prung-pung sounds, along with the gunshots from Fat Tai and Dabin's hands, the 2 men fell to the ground. From head to shoulder, blood splattered everywhere. Looking at the corpses on the ground and the pool of blood mixed with the snow, none of the 3 men looked happy. They turned back to look at the quiet water in the ice hole. It had been several minutes. Any normal person would find it hard to survive in this place. After all, the temperature of this river was not something a human body could withstand. However, none of the 3 men spoke. Fat Tai and Dabin continued to stare up. Feng Ling's back was to the water behind her, her hand gripping the gun handle tightly. All of a sudden, there was a splash from the water behind her. Someone had emerged from the water. "Boss!" Fat Tai and Dabin abruptly shouted in that direction in disbelief. Feng Ling also abruptly turned around. First, she saw a pair of hands reaching out from the water, firmly and accurately climbing onto the edge of the ice hole. Following that, Li Nanheng's had emerged from the water. In this extremely cold weather, the man's entire body was covered in blood as he climbed onto the edge of the ice hole. The man used the last bit of strength he had left to find an exit. Before his strength was completely exhausted, Feng Ling and Dabin immediately rushed over to grab one of his hands. Fat Tai was afraid that he would be in danger if he stood there with his weight, so he stood behind Feng Ling and told her to lie down. Then, he tugged on her leg to help her pull back. Finally, the 3 of them worked together to pull Li Nanheng out of the water. Li Nanheng fell onto the ice and took several deep breaths. At the same time, he coughed out 2 mouthfuls of water and closed his eyes. However, they could see that he was breathing heavily, but his strength was completely exhausted. Feng Ling, Fat Tai, and Dabin removed their winter clothes to cover him while checking his body. There were no injuries. It seemed like the water on the surface belonged to the other party and not Li Nanheng. To avoid being surrounded by others, Dabin and Fat Tai used their strength to help Li Nanheng up. They turned back to give Feng Ling a look. "Let's go." Feng Ling caught the guns that Dabin tossed over. She rearranged the bullets in the 2 guns in her hands and placed them by her waist. If there was another ambush, the 2 of them would support Li Nanheng while she dealt with the enemy. Just like that, they quickly moved along the river and returned to the safe and hidden path. In the 10 minutes that they walked back up the mountain, Li Nanheng, who was initially breathing heavily, was no longer moving. Dabin occasionally reached out to feel his body temperature. As he did so, he frowned and said in a low voice, "It's similar to Fatty's situation that day. It's already a miracle that Boss was able to deal with that piece of trash and climb back up safely in such a cold environment. The temperature is beyond what a normal person can endure, but right now his body temperature is rising rapidly." After that, they did not speak anymore and only sped up to return. When they returned to the camp at the top of the snow mountain, Dehu and the others had already dealt with the group of people. Seeing Feng Ling and the others had returned, they were about to welcome them when they saw Li Nanheng being supported from afar. Their hearts immediately skipped a beat and they quickly ran over. "What's wrong? Let's talk in the tent." "Hurry, boil water. Boil more water." Dabin instructed as he quickly helped Li Nanheng into the tent. Dahu nodded and turned back to call out to the other 4 people. Everyone immediately gathered. Although she was worried, Feng Ling was still one of the people in charge of this operation at Rogers Pass. She paused outside the tent and turned back to look at Dahu, who was about to go to another tent to boil water. The people on the other side of the mountain have been dealt with. Dahu nodded. There are only about a dozen people up there. They have been hiding behind the mountain wall, not daring to come out. But if they dare to poke their heads out, we will instantly kill them. They have all been dealt with. Chapter 889. When I was underwater, only half of my body was in the water. I felt as though I was going to freeze in an instant. The cold air kept coming out of my body. I couldn't move at all. Standing by the bed, Fat Tai watched Li Nanheng, who had been quickly changed into dry clothes but had fallen into a coma due to a serious high fever. He said sympathetically, "Boss, you can hold on for so long. You're really not a human."
Scram.
"Why are you still making sarcastic remarks at a time like this?" Dabin scolded him. "I'm not being sarcastic. I'm just saying that I understand how uncomfortable Boss is feeling right now. In this kind of cold water, and with such a sudden high fever, I'm lucky that I survived." Fat Tai frowned. "Boss's fever has reached 40 degrees Celsius in an instant. It's even worse than when I was at that time." In fact, Fat Tai was right. No matter how good Li Nanheng's physique was, it was not easy for him to come out safely in the cold water that was beyond the range of ordinary people. Even Li Nanheng couldn't resist this kind of physical limit and collapsed in the end. However, the current situation was that even though they had prepared sufficient cold medicine such as cold medicine and fever medicine, his body temperature still did not drop in the past hour. Instead, it rose by a few tenths of a degree. He really couldn't continue to burn like this. At the same time, they helped him to cool down physically. Fortunately, after experiencing what happened to Fat Tai a while ago, everyone was familiar with the physics of lowering the temperature. They cooperated very well, and their speed was also very fast. Because they were the ones who had taken care of Fat Tai, they helped Li Nanheng change his clothes, quickly wiped his body, and did not ask Feng Ling to intervene. Seeing that they were taking care of Boss, even though Feng Ling couldn't feel at ease, she trusted them very much. They had just finished dealing with those people and couldn't gather everyone in the tent. Feng Ling went out and reported the situation to the base hall using the only cell phone that could temporarily contact the base. She also asked who to go down with her to count all the corpses at the foot of the mountain and on the opposite side of the mountain, and then reported them one by one. When the sky was completely dark, Feng Ling and who returned to their camp. The moment they returned, they saw that they were already busy preparing dinner. Everything was peaceful inside and outside, except for Li Nanheng, who was lying in the tent. "How is it? Has Boss's fever subsided?" Who quickly walked over and asked. One of the members, who was squatting on the ground and busy setting up the fire, shook his head. Who frowned. "What should we do?" "Boss, don't collapse." With that, he turned back to look at Feng Ling. "Feng Ling, contact the base's doctor." Before he finished speaking, Feng Ling had already entered the tent. Everyone else had already left. Only Fat Tai and Dabin remained inside. Fat Tai sat at the table not far away, scratching his ears and cheeks in frustration and worry. Dabin reached out to feel Li Nanheng's body temperature from time to time, but his brows were tightly furrowed. Seeing that Feng Ling had returned, Fat Tai stood up to ask, "Have you informed the base's infirmary?" "I have. They have already contacted the doctors in Montana to rush over. However, the entire city of Montana is snowy today, and the plane cannot take off. If they rush over in the snow, it will take at least on tomorrow or even longer," Feng Ling said in a low voice. "We can only think of a way to stabilize Boss's body temperature ourselves." Fat Tai had a high fever for 3 consecutive days. At that time, his temperature was 39 degrees Celsius. Right now, Boss's temperature is 40 degrees Celsius. If it goes any higher, he won't be able to endure it. Dabin furrowed his brows. Furthermore, although Boss is unconscious, he hasn't completely fallen asleep. He should be feeling very uncomfortable. The coldness in his body has seeped into his bones, but his body temperature is still so high. If this continues, the extreme temperature inside and outside of his body won't be something an ordinary person can endure. But since the doctors can't rush over for now, we can only lower his temperature ourselves, Dabin said with a frown. Dabin continued, I just called Dr. Wen. Dr. Wen told me a few effective methods to reduce the fever. Let's try them all. The next day, early in the morning, Feng Ling, who had stayed by the bed for the entire night, abruptly heard some movements. She opened her eyes to see that Li Nanheng, who had been lying on the bed, had fallen to the ground. The glass of water on the bedside table had also fallen to the ground. She instantly understood that Boss had woken up and was probably drinking water. Feng Ling immediately stood up to help him up. Dabin, who was also in the tent, also rushed over to help. Boss, how are you? Feng Ling asked. However, the man did not respond. After helping him back to the bed, she could see that Li Nanheng seemed to be frowning in discomfort. Due to the high fever that had not subsided all night, his face and lips were pale and dry. Earlier, he had woken up due to thirst. When he woke up, it was only an instinctive thought. However, it was impossible for him to hold on for long. Feng Ling rushed to pour a new glass of warm water. She placed a straw in it and brought it to his mouth. As expected, when Li Nanheng frowned in discomfort, he would instinctively take a few sips when he felt the presence of the straw and water. However, he only had the strength to drink a few mouthfuls before he stopped moving. Feng Ling stood up and brought the spoon over. She slowly fed him spoonful after spoonful of water. When she had fed him more than half the glass of water, Dabin took a look at the thermometer and then shook his head at Feng Ling. It hasn't subsided, Dabin said. I'll call the doctors again. We've already informed them yesterday. It's an order from the base hall. Those doctors don't dare to delay. If they could come over immediately, it wouldn't have taken so long. As Feng Ling spoke, she picked up a cotton swab and dipped it into the water to moisten Li Nanheng's pale and dry lips. Such a high fever would cause a person's body to lose water very quickly. She had already fed him water several times last night, but right now, she could feel that because of his high fever, the water only stayed on his lips for a while before it immediately dried up. She had to continue moistening his lips like this, or else it would easily crack and bleed. Right now, what I'm most worried about is if the doctors don't arrive in time. With just the few of us. Chapter 890. I told you not to worry, but look at you. You didn't sleep at all last night. You just closed your eyes for less than an hour, and you're already starting again. Dabin watched Feng Ling moisten Boss Li's lips and sighed. Go rest first. Call Fatai and the others to replace you. There are so many of us. Let's take turns. It's fine. I can't sleep even if I lie down. Who can sleep with Boss's fever? That was true. Although the others were not in this tent, when Dabin went to the other side last night, they did not sleep well. Even when they lay down, they could not sleep well. They were all worried about Boss's condition. They could not all stay in this tent because Boss would occasionally have difficulty breathing due to his high fever. It would be more uncomfortable if there were too many people, so the others could only wait next door and take turns to take care of him. Although Boss can't wake up, he can still drink water. I'll go make some porridge. Feed him some. Feng Ling nodded. On the morning of the second day, after Li Nanheng fell into a coma due to a high fever, a group of people were busy cooking porridge. It was difficult to feed porridge. It was not as easy as feeding water, but thankfully, Feng Ling was the most patient. Even if it took 2 hours to cook a small bowl of porridge when it was cold, she would heat it up and feed it to him over and over again. In the evening, the doctors still hadn't arrived. They called the base, and the base was also very worried about the situation here. They said that they would check again, but in the end, the result was that they couldn't contact the doctor they had sent, and they had also temporarily lost contact with a base member stationed in Montana. At night, the base sent them a message saying that the base members and doctors had encountered an avalanche on the way here. All the cars on the road had been trapped. With the speed of rescue in Montana and the traffic conditions, they might not be able to rescue the trapped people even after another 48 hours. The base needed to send reinforcements, but the snowstorm would greatly affect the speed and quality of the helicopter rescue. In other words, in the next 2 or 3 days, even if the people of the base were here, it would be difficult for them to fly over. In addition, the doctors were trapped on the road of the avalanche, so they had to save them as soon as possible. The doctors only had a few cars, and they didn't have any auxiliary gasoline, food, or any other supplies to keep out the cold. Their lives were at stake, and there were several doctors in the cars, so they had to save them first. Even if Bosley was awake, he would arrange for them to save the doctors first. The snowstorm in Montana also affected the weather at Rogers Pass. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the temperature dropped several degrees. No one went out and could only stay in the tents to keep warm. Just like this, Li Nanheng endured for 3 days. His body temperature dropped to 39 degrees yesterday, but it remained at 39 degrees and did not drop any further. He was still unconscious. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Feng Ling, who had been taking care of him for 2 to 3 days, could not take it anymore. She was forcefully dragged by Da, Hu, and Bin to the next room to sleep. Feng Ling was indeed tired. After being forced to drink a cup of warm water and milk, she collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Although she had nightmares because she was still worried, she could at least rest for a few hours. She slept until 11:00 at night. It was quiet on the snow-capped mountain. When Feng Ling opened her eyes, she saw that there were people lying on the beds by the side. Everyone was asleep. She sat up and quietly got off the bed. She didn't wake them up and then went to the tent where only she and Li Nanheng lived. When she entered the tent, she could vaguely smell the scent of white wine in the air. However, in order to lower Boss's temperature, she had used white wine to wipe his body and the joints of his limbs. Feng Ling did not pay much attention to it. She walked in and saw that Fat Tai was sitting by the bed. However, his head was lowered bit by bit. It was clear that he was about to fall asleep. She walked over and patted Fatty's shoulder. She lowered her voice and asked, "Where's Bin? Why are you alone?" Fat Tai was startled awake. He turned back to look at her and sighed in relief. He's on night duty today. He's patrolling outside. He's worried that there might be enemies hiding in the surroundings, so he went to the other side and the river. He just left not long ago. By the time he comes back, it'll be daybreak. Feng Ling glanced at Fat Tai. "You go sleep next door. I've been sleeping since the afternoon. I'm fine now. I'll keep watch. You go sleep." Fat Tai nodded. He was indeed extremely tired. He stood up and stretched lazily before heading out. However, before he reached the entrance of the tent, he suddenly heard Feng Ling's surprised voice. "Why is there such a strong smell of wine? Did you wipe wine on Boss's body again?" Fat Tai paused in his footsteps. He turned back and chuckled. "No, I fed Boss a bottle of white wine." Feng Ling's hand, which was about to touch Li Nanheng's forehead, froze. She abruptly turned to look at Fat Tai. "What wine? Boss's fever is so high, and you fed him wine? Are you crazy?" "Don't get agitated." Fat Tai saw Feng Ling's angry expression and rushed to explain. "In fact, I just experienced such a high fever a while ago. I know how uncomfortable Boss is right now. I've just measured Boss's temperature, and it has already dropped to 38.6 degrees. He's probably going to recover soon, but because of the high fever a few days ago, his head hurts so much that I wanted to die. When I was in such a state, I really hoped that someone could give me some wine so that I wouldn't feel so uncomfortable. However, at that time, I couldn't open my eyes and didn't have the strength to speak. I felt that Boss should be in the same state as me at that time, so I fed him a bottle of white wine. It's not much, just 4 or 5 ounces. 4 or 5 ounces? If Feng Ling's eyes could kill, Fatty's heart would have been pierced by thousands of arrows. "Fat Tai, this is murder, do you know? He's having a fever. It's really okay. A man won't be so weak after a serious illness. Besides, wine is like an anesthetic. It can relieve a lot of pain. Scram." Feng Ling shouted angrily. Seeing that she was really angry, Fat Tai could only stop speaking. He wanted to explain, but when he saw that Feng Ling's expression was extremely ugly, he could only wait for Bin to return tomorrow morning. He turned to leave the tent. Feng Ling sat by the bed with a cold expression. She touched the man's forehead and picked up the thermometer by the side. When she saw that it was indeed 38.6 degrees, she released a sigh of relief. However, when she lowered her head, she could smell the scent of alcohol on the man's body. She secretly rolled her eyes at the tent next door. Seeing Fat Tai smiling fawningly at her from the window of the tent next door, she angrily reached over and tugged the curtain down, blocking the view from the other side. Chapter 891. She couldn't tell if Fat Tai was too muddle-headed or he was too kind-hearted, but this damn fatty was definitely a typical careless and heartless person. A person with a high fever shouldn't drink alcohol even if he had a serious headache. Feng Ling was worried that Li Nanheng would continue to have a fever because of the alcohol, so she sat by the bed to test his temperature from time to time. She had already fed him the alcohol. She could only pray that Boss Li's physical fitness could withstand this damn fatty's alcohol. After observing by the bed for a while and making sure that Li Nanheng seemed to be fine except for his slightly unstable breathing, Feng Ling got up to get some water. She then returned to the bed to feed Li Nanheng water and moisten his lips. She got up to get a basin of water to help him wipe his body when she suddenly saw Li Nanheng's eyes slowly open. The man's alcohol tolerance was not very good because of his high fever. He looked at her with slightly tipsy eyes. Seeing that he was awake, Feng Ling immediately leaned over to him in surprise and asked softly, "Boss, you're awake?" Li Nanheng did not speak. The moment he opened his eyes, he saw Feng Ling's face and the boy's slightly haggard appearance from taking care of him by the bed. He seemed to have lost at least 1 kilogram.
"Boss."
Seeing that he had woken up but did not speak, Feng Ling looked at his eyes. She didn't know if it was because of the high fever or because he had been forced to drink, but he did not look very sober. Afraid that he would have a headache, she raised her hand and gently rubbed his temples. As she did so, she said, "Does your head hurt a lot? Do you feel better now?" The man still did not speak and only looked at her from a slightly close distance. Feng Ling felt that he seemed to be looking at her, but also seemed to be looking at something else through her face. It seemed to be focused, but also seemed to be unfocused. Could it be that he had finally opened his eyes after being unconscious for many days, but in fact, his mind was not fully awake? Feng Ling hesitated for a moment and was about to throw the towel and her hand back into the basin by the side. Just as she turned around, she suddenly felt her wrist burning. The man grabbed it, and she didn't know where he got the strength from. He just stared at her face, and without saying a word, he suddenly pulled her down. She was caught off guard, and she fell back onto the bed, lying on the man's chest. The towel in her hand fell to the ground because of her sudden movement. The basin next to her was knocked over by her leg, and the water spilled onto the ground. Feng Ling was startled. She was about to get up from his embrace, but in the blink of an eye, the man suddenly pushed her over and pressed her under his body. His eyes, which were slightly red and dark from the long period of fever and alcohol, stared at her. She didn't know how to describe his gaze, but it was like the gaze of a bloodthirsty wolf when it saw the food it wanted to eat the most. It was fierce, persistent, domineering, and greedy, adding a hint of sharpness. "Boss." Feng Ling wanted to push him away, but the man directly held her raised hands and pressed them against the side of her head. His dark gaze locked onto her face. Feng Ling inexplicably sensed some kind of danger. She returned his gaze, and her brows immediately twitched. She rushed to get up, but the man still held her wrists tightly and pressed her down on the bed. She struggled, but found that she couldn't break free from a man who had a high fever for more than 3 days. She wanted to use force again, but because she deliberately avoided his injured wrist, she couldn't use too much force to fling him away. She raised her leg and was about to use the posture of bending her knee to push him away. However, the instant her knee was bent, Li Nanheng's gaze was heavy, and he kissed her heavily. What are you doing, you?" Feng Ling's eyes widened. Because of the man's sudden kiss, She instinctively looked toward the entrance of the tent. At a time like this, if De Bin returned early from his patrol and was seen by others, she would not be able to explain herself. Boss. Feng Ling forced herself to tilt her body and use her shoulder to push him away. However, because of her movements, the man's gaze became even darker as he watched her face. He did not hesitate to kiss her again. He did not say a single word, nor did he give any explanation. He kissed her fiercely. This was a kiss that was truly fierce. Unlike that day at his residence, when he could at least maintain his consciousness, at this moment, he clearly was not sober. Because of this, Feng Ling could not push him away. No matter how she struggled, he would press her down. She suddenly regretted finding opportunities to feed him these past few days. If she directly starved him for 3 days, let's see if he would still have so much strength. Because of his fierce kiss, her lips were numb and swollen. Feng Ling's hands were pressed firmly against the bed. She opened her mouth to bite him. Although the man still had the strength to restrain her physically, his reaction speed was clearly affected. After being bitten by her, not only did he not sober up, but his eyes were as dark as the night. He ignored the bloody taste on his lips and lowered his head to bite her lips as well. Like a ferocious beast that was determined to devour its prey, he did not hesitate or show any mercy. Feng Ling was angered by his crazed actions. However, when he was rational, she could not push him away. Right now, when he was irrational and reeking of alcohol, she could not push him away at all. When her lips were bitten by this man and she kept resisting, the man restrained her hands behind her back and held her chin with his other hand. His kiss deepened and became more resolute. With their mouths sealed, in the warm tent, the two of them seemed to be in a silent confrontation. Feng Ling glared at him, but because of her gaze and her incessant struggle, he did not hesitate to abruptly tug down his hand that was originally holding her chin. The air immediately heard a rip sound. The small shirt in the collar of her thin down jacket was instantly torn by the man, and the fabric was piled up in the collar of the down jacket. Because of this action, Feng Ling's hair all stood on end. However, no matter how she struggled, this man had thousands of ways to lock her hands and feet in such an unconscious state. When she was about to use the same trick to twist her body away, the zipper of her down jacket had already been tugged down by the man. Chapter 892. Feng Ling's body instantly trembled. She didn't care if he was drunk or confused, nor did she care about the wound on his hand. She struggled to break free. This time, the man used even more strength to press down on her. He bent down and abruptly bit the edge of her chest-wrapping cloth. When the man lowered his head, his short hair brushed past her collarbone. She immediately trembled uncontrollably from the itch, as though all the pores on her body had opened in that instant. The man used his teeth to tear off her chest-wrapping cloth firmly and quickly. The moment her chest suddenly turned cold, Feng Ling felt that her head was about to explode. Li Nanheng. She was afraid of disturbing the people in the tent next door, so she suppressed her voice and called his name in a low warning tone. Don't go too far. However, Li Nanheng seemed to not hear her words. His teeth and his raised hand cooperated very well, and in a few seconds, her clothes were completely open. Feng Ling was enraged. She twisted her body with force, but the man suddenly bent down and kissed her, sealing her mouth that was about to curse. He was still burning and entangling her mouth with a burning force. She bit him with all her might, but he didn't dodge. However, when she suddenly turned her head and bit his shoulder in anger, the man only let out a low chuckle from his chest. She didn't know what this chuckle meant. It seemed that he was in a good mood, but it also seemed to be mockery, and it seemed to have other meanings. In any case, when she heard it, she felt her scalp tingle. You really hit it well. The man's first words after he woke up were these 5 words by her ear. His voice was extremely hoarse. This hoarseness contained the haggardness of a high fever, but also some long-hidden desire that was boiling. Feng Ling's expression also stiffened because of his words. She turned her eyes abruptly, but the man took the opportunity to kiss her again. His hands were not idle. Unlike usual, he could at least maintain his rationality. Right now, he could not resist and directly pulled her pants. His clear purpose made Foam Ling's heart tremble. Damn it! Was this man crazy from the fever or drunk? Was he going to force himself on her? Or did this high fever make him so sick that he didn't even have the most basic politeness between people? You want to come here directly? Foam Ling couldn't push him away and could only bite his shoulder. However, before she could bite too hard, the man tilted her chin and kissed her deeply for a long time. Finally, the man's hand touched her unprotected body. Although he still had a fever, his movements were very fast. His hands and mouth were not idle. In an instant, he lowered his head and kissed her neck and collarbone. Whether it was the man's hands or his kiss, it was as if they were spreading a prairie fire on her body, burning her to the point where her blood began to boil. He was going crazy. In the afternoon, when she went to sleep in the tent next door, she only wore a thin down jacket over her shirt and a pair of pajama pants. It was actually very easy to take them off. After all, they were very loose and soft. The neckline of her shirt was originally very large. After he pulled it open, it was scattered on both sides of her body. Whether it was the visual effect or the impact of the sight of her chest wrapping being pulled open, it all stimulated the man's nerves. It was not that Foam Ling had never seen such a thing happen on the training ground. However, right now, she was actually unable to resist such an accident. The man held her and kissed and nibbled on her neck. He kissed her randomly. Sometimes it hurt, and sometimes it was kissed until it was numb. Her whole body was trembling. She didn't know if it was because of anger or because of the kisses. However, her hands were still tightly locked behind her back. Using the weight of their bodies, he pressed her hands down, and she could not move at all. When Li Nanheng finally turned his kiss to her ear, she gritted her teeth and lowered her voice to say, "Li Nanheng, are you sober or not? Are you crazy? Do you know what this place is? Someone can come in at any time. Whether it's Fatai, Dabin, or the other people next door, anyone can come in at any time. This tent doesn't even have a door." Before she could finish speaking, the man had already sucked her earlobe and moved around the edges of her ears. Foam Ling, who had never been stimulated like this before, trembled uncontrollably. She wanted to avoid him, but the man held her face and kissed her on the cheek. As he kissed, his hands moved to undo her clothes. Foam Ling gritted her teeth. She hated that her physical strength was inferior to his. A man who had a high fever for 3 days could subdue her. If she really met someone with brute force on the battlefield in the future, would she be sacrificed on the spot? No wonder, even though she felt that she was outstanding in all aspects, Li Nanheng always ridiculed her physical strength. It seemed like there was indeed nothing wrong with his ridicule. Compared to a tall man like him, her physical strength was indeed much weaker. Even though she was clearly being violated by him, she was actually unable to struggle free. The place that no one had ever touched before sent a numbing sensation that made her feel as though she had been electrocuted. She bit her lips and turned to glare at him. However, the man chuckled and hoarsely whispered in her ear, "Little liar." Because of these 3 words, Foam Ling felt as though she had been electrocuted from head to toe. She glared at him from the corner of her eyes and tried to move again. However, her hands, which were restrained behind her back, could not move at all. She turned to bite him hatefully, but the man turned his face and kissed her other ear, causing her body to tremble uncontrollably. She could not even use the most basic strength to struggle free. As the man kissed her, he held up one of her hands and easily pried open her fist. She thought he was going to pull her hand down again, but when she was about to struggle back, the man lowered his head and kissed her palm. This kiss landed on the slightly protruding callus on her soft, white palm. When he kissed it, the man closed his eyes as though he was pious and affectionate. All of Foam Ling's struggling movements paused because of the man's kiss. She stared blankly at the man who was pressing against her and watched in disbelief as he kissed her palm. Chapter 893. Ever since she was brought out of the wolf's cave by those people at the age of 5, she had never shed a single tear. She didn't even remember what it felt like to cry. After so many years, it seemed like the last time she cried was when she was starving in the wolf's cave when she was 3 or 4 years old. At that time, she was skinny and couldn't eat her fill. She was young and didn't know anything. When she couldn't find food, she would cry. After that, she forgot how to cry. But right now, her eyes actually felt a little warm. It was clearly a thin callus on her palm, but Foam Ling felt that it was more sensitive than any other place. She wanted to retract her hand, but the man held her wrist tightly. This kiss lingered on her palm for a long time. When Foam Ling completely stopped struggling, he slowly kissed along her palm to her wrist. He kissed the artery on her wrist. Perhaps because of the artery, along with her violent heartbeat, he kissed it bit by bit, until the man's lips turned over. Foam Ling's hands instantly clenched the bedsheets under her, and her toes instantly straightened. It was as though the world had darkened, causing all the rationality in her mind to burn away in an instant. The last bit of instinct in her mind reminded her not to continue and that she had to push him away. However, it was as though the man's warmth still remained in her palm. When the man kissed her, the pitiful gaze in his eyes was something she had never seen before. A child like her who had been raised by a wolf would one day be pitied by someone? Someone like her who had disregarded everything just to have a mouthful of hot food to eat, a warm bed to sleep in, and a good life, would also be treated so gently by someone? Would she be looked at like a woman, and even feel heartache and love? Even if it was only a thin callus, would it be treated as a trace of all the hard work and struggle in life? Would it be understood and felt heartache? She didn't know what kind of emotion was interfering with her thoughts, but she didn't move at all. She even forgot that someone might come into the tent at any time. However, the man didn't stop moving at all. Her hands kept gripping the bedsheets, and all kinds of thoughts kept circling in her mind. The man bit her lips hard because of the high fever. She couldn't help but suck in a breath of air. However, she couldn't even make a sound. She suppressed all the pain and sobs that were about to come out of her mouth. The alcohol was hot. The hope in the valley was burning hot. His body temperature was the same. The love and hate that had been buried in the base for so many years were awakened at this moment. Under the tent, under the dim light, the curtains would occasionally be blown up by the cold wind, and the small windows of the tent were completely sealed. No matter how the man moved, because his fever had not subsided, he did not sweat. However, Foam Ling's forehead was already covered in sweat. She clutched the man's arm tightly and suddenly felt a sense of helplessness. She didn't know how to continue since things had developed to this point, but she still instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck and felt the strong alcohol on the man's body. For nearly 2 hours, Foam Ling felt as though she was being cooked in a pot of oil, tossing and turning. In short, the first time she had sex with a man in her life was not very comfortable. Li Nanheng was not sober at all. After tasting the taste of ecstasy, he exerted more and more force. She did not even have the strength to bite him, let alone struggle. The man pinched her waist tightly and did not stop moving. She clutched the quilt under her, feeling the man's passionate drunkenness and the burning temperature. For the first time in her life, she felt that her injury might be a little serious. And it was internal injury. When everything was over, there was still no sound outside. The man did not even have time to tidy up his clothes and directly lay on the bed. He was still drunk. She didn't know if it was because he was tired after the illness or because he felt refreshed after satisfying his desire. In any case, he just lay down and fell asleep again. Foam Ling endured the pain all over her body, especially the terrible pain in her lower body, and barely crawled away from the man. Because of the pain, she did not hold the bed firmly and abruptly fell to the ground. She sat up and grabbed her torn clothes and chest-wrapping cloth. She then picked up the down jacket and wrapped it around her body. Although it was difficult, she still dragged the luggage out from under the bed and took out new chest-wrapping cloth and other clothes. She then tossed the torn clothes into the stove in the tent and burned them. She then staggered slowly into the bathroom. Because she was afraid that Dabin would find something strange when he returned from his patrol, She endured the pain and took only 5 minutes to take a quick shower. After putting on her clothes, she slowly walked out and looked at the man lying on the bed. After a long time, she finally went to tidy up everything on the bed. Thankfully, the bedsheets were black, and the bloodstain was hidden in the darkness and would not be discovered. She wiped the man's body clean and pulled the bedsheets out from under him. This bastard had been suffering from a fever for the past few days. Everyone had been wiping his body to lower his temperature, so he was not wearing any clothes. She simply removed his pants and covered him with the blanket. Feeling that Dabin and the others would not notice anything, she finally let out a long sigh and sat on the bed weakly. Earlier, Li Nanheng was not conscious at all. Regardless of whether it was the gentle kiss he gave her or the ferocity he displayed during that time, they were all based on his instincts. Thus, her first time was not treated gently at all. In fact, each time was more and more ferocious. She suspected that she might really be torn apart. Feng Ling sat by the bed. She felt that even the slightest movement would cause her entire body to ache. She turned to look at the man lying on the bed as though nothing had happened. Her gaze then shifted to the empty bottle of white wine on the table by the side. She raised her hand to touch her chest. Thinking back to how the man had used his teeth to tear open her chest-wrapping cloth, Feng Ling felt her entire head heat up. However, Li Nanheng had already discovered it. Looking at the man's face, Feng Ling could not tell if he had fallen into a coma or was just sleeping. Would she be chased out of the base? Chapter 894. Dawn arrived. Dabin returned from the outside covered in snow. The first thing he did was to return to Li Nanheng's tent. Why did you change people? Didn't we agree to have Fat Tai take care of him tonight? You haven't slept well for several days. What are you doing here? Dabin shook off the snow on his clothes as he approached the bed. At the same time, he glanced at the man who appeared to be unconscious. How is it? Does he still have a fever? Feng Ling returned to her senses. Only then did she realize that she had been sitting here in a daze for several hours and had forgotten to check Boss's temperature. She picked up the thermometer and said, 38 degrees. Although he still has a fever, this temperature shouldn't be a problem for Boss. He's already survived 40 degrees. He should be fine now. Dabin glanced at Feng Ling as he spoke. He suddenly furrowed his brows and lowered his head to look at her carefully. What happened to your neck? Feng Ling abruptly raised her hand and placed it on her neck. Although her clothes were thick, her collar was not very high. Back then, she had been in a rush to put on her clothes and did not notice the hickeys on her neck. My throat isn't feeling well. I learned from some old people and rubbed my neck with wine. It might have turned red. From this angle, Dabin could only see a small red mark. Before he could take a closer look, Feng Ling had already covered it up by tugging on her collar. He did not suspect anything. In this world of ice and snow, anyone could catch a cold or a fever. It was normal for someone to have a sore throat. Furthermore, Feng Ling had been taking care of Boss for the past few days. It was likely that she was tired and uncomfortable. Dabin, I'm not feeling well. I'll go rest next door. I know you've been patrolling outside for an entire night. I'll call Dahu over. There's no need. If you're not feeling well, hurry and lie down to sleep. No body can withstand the fact that you've been guarding here for the past few days. As Dabin spoke, he used his chin to point at the entrance of the tent, meaning to urge her to quickly go and rest. He didn't intend to keep her. Feng Ling stood up. She did not look at the man on the bed and headed out. When she was about to reach the door, she paused and turned back to speak. Last night, Fatai fed Boss a bottle of white wine to alleviate his headache and dizziness. Right now, I don't know if Boss's body can take it. Although the temperature has temporarily dropped, I feel that the fever might rise again at any time. You guys keep a close eye on him. Sika. Damn fatty, did a donkey kick you in the head? How can a person with a high fever drink alcohol? Dabin was so angry that he was about to choke. He's just doing it out of good intentions. Although Feng Ling was angry, in order to prevent Dabin's bad temper from getting back at Fatai, She told him to keep an eye on Li Nanhing's temperature and comforted him. After Dabin angrily sat down on the bed with a straight face, he left the tent. His body was really uncomfortable and sore. He was so tired that he wanted to lie down and sleep until the sky turned dark. However, the moment she walked out, she was hit by the cold wind outside. The early morning wind was especially cold. Foam Ling released a long breath. She raised her hand and pulled her collar up a little. She stood outside for a while. She did not wear the thickest winter clothes and only wore a thin feather coat. The cold wind quickly penetrated through her clothes, but it was as though only this kind of bone-chilling cold could freeze all traces of heat inside and outside of her body. Everything returned to calmness amidst the confusion and unconsciousness. It was unknown how long Foam Ling stood outside. Fat Tai was sleeping soundly when he suddenly felt a wave of cold air approaching. He opened his eyes in fright. In the blink of an eye, he saw Foam Ling lying under the blanket about a meter away from him. She then covered her head with the blanket and fell asleep without saying a word. Fat Tai sat up abruptly and pushed her through the blanket. "Hey, Foam Ling, did boss's fever subside last night? Where did you go earlier? How long have you been standing outside? You're so cold that even the cold air outside has been brought in." Seeing that Foam Ling didn't respond, Fat Tai frowned and muttered, "You can't lie down like this. You have to warm up before lying down. Otherwise, you won't be warm under the quilt when you're cold all over." Seeing that Foam Ling still didn't respond, when Fat Tai was about to pull her blanket, the person inside seemed to be in a very bad mood and firmly pulled the blanket up, not allowing anyone to lift the blanket. Fat Tai paused and had to stop pulling her, but he was afraid that she would really get sick. They had just come to Roger's Pass for a short time, but he caught a cold and had a high fever, and Boss was still in a coma. If Foam Ling also got seriously ill, this place would probably leave a big shadow in their hearts, and they would never come here again. Fat Eye got out of bed and pushed the stove to the bedside closest to Foam Ling. After making sure that the blanket wouldn't be burned and that it could warm Foam Ling, he turned his head and motioned to the others who were ready to get up to lower their voices and let Foam Ling have a good rest. Everyone knew that Foam Ling had been taking care of Boss these days and probably didn't have a good rest yesterday afternoon. They didn't expect that she would take care of him again last night. Even without Fatty's reminder, they consciously got out of bed and put on their clothes quietly, trying not to disturb Foam Ling. Especially when they heard that Foam Ling might not be feeling well, they decided to go to the tent next door for breakfast and leave the tent here for Foam Ling to have a good rest. After Foam Ling fell into the quilt, she felt her numb head heat up, but she only closed her eyes and didn't move. She didn't want to talk to anyone and didn't want to say a word. In the afternoon, Foam Ling was a little drowsy and couldn't open her eyes, but she vaguely heard someone go back to the tent to get something. "What should we do? Didn't Boss's body temperature drop a lot yesterday? How come his fever is back to 39 degrees? Boss's physical fitness and resistance are definitely the best in our base. Is this the legendary saying that he doesn't get sick for several years, and it takes a long time to recover once he gets sick? Of course not. It's all because of Fat Tai, that damned fatty, who forced Boss to drink in the middle of the night. Boss hasn't woken up yet. It must have something to do with that bottle of wine. The alcohol content is so high. Only Boss Lee's body can withstand it. If it were anyone else, Fat Tai would have committed murder. Boss has been sleeping for several days now. The water in the river is really terrible. Even Boss can fall down, alas." Chapter 895. Hearing their conversation, Foam Ling frowned in her sleep. She wanted to open her eyes, but had no strength. Her eyelids drooped, and she couldn't open them at all. Then she heard their footsteps as they walked out of the tent. Although she wanted to wake up as soon as possible, she eventually fell asleep again. When she regained consciousness, someone was wiping her face with a cold towel. She couldn't open her eyes and only heard Da, whose voice close to her. Foam Ling must have caught a cold, but he doesn't have a fever. His body temperature is around 37 degrees. It's not serious. Let him rest for 2 days. After that, she couldn't hear clearly what the others were saying. She fell into a deep sleep again. Seeing that she had been sleeping with her clothes on, who originally wanted to help her unbutton her clothes so that she could lie down comfortably, but he found that even though Fengling was asleep, her hand was still tightly gripping a corner of the quilt as if she had lost her sense of security. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pry it off. The temperature in the tent was not particularly high. If she didn't want to take off her clothes, they wouldn't force her. He tried to lift her quilt several times, but she instinctively pulled it back and didn't allow anyone to touch it. After another day, Fengling heard Fat Tai muttering in her sleep, "Oh, what should we do? Both Boss and Fengling are sick. The two of them don't seem to be sick at all in our base. Now that they are sick, they seem to be accompanying each other. It's really hard for us. You still have the nerve to say that? If you hadn't secretly fed Boss alcohol, he would have woken up long ago. You can get out of bed and jump around for 5 days. Isn't Boss's physical fitness better than yours? Anyone can complain here, but you don't have the right to." Fat Tai was immediately scolded into silence. After a long while, he said, "I was really kind. At that time, I was so uncomfortable that I wish someone could get me drunk. You are you, and Boss is Boss. How can they be the same?" Who smacked Fatty's head with his hand. If Boss's physique was any worse, the people from the base would have had to brave the snowstorm and risk countless lives just to send Boss to the hospital for emergency treatment. Luckily, Boss is in good health. Otherwise, you would have to bear the responsibility of a murder case. Another 2 days passed. Li Nanheng woke up. "Boss, you're awake? How do you feel? Where does it hurt or feel uncomfortable? Do you want to eat something first?" Fat Tai stayed by the bed and asked with an apologetic and earnest expression. Li Nanheng furrowed his brows and glanced at Fat Tai, who seemed to be trying to please him. He opened his mouth, but his voice was hoarse as though it was filled with sand. "How many days did I sleep for?" Fat Tai raised his hand and gestured 6. 6 days, oh no, it's almost 7 days. It's already night time. Li Nanheng sat up, and Fat Tai rushed to help him up. Just as he was about to turn to pour water, Li Nanheng said hoarsely, "Call Dabin over." Fat Tai hurriedly went to call Dabin. When he called for Dabin, everyone heard him. Knowing that Boss had woken up, everyone rushed into the tent. Li Nanheng glanced at Dabin and then at the others. Everyone was present except for Fengling. He did not ask. After Dabin came over, he simply asked a few questions about what happened after he fell into the ice cave, as well as about those gangsters. After asking, Li Nanheng's stamina was almost exhausted, and he was helped back to the bed. The group of people were busy preparing porridge, medicine, and water for Boss. After lying down for so long, Fengling did not come over. Li Nanheng asked Fat Tai, "Where's Fengling?" Boss, I forgot to tell you. Fengling has been busy taking care of you for the past few days. One time, she didn't sleep for 2 days and 3 nights. Her body couldn't take it anymore, and she caught a slight cold. These 2 days, she has been resting in the tent next door." Fat Tai chuckled and scratched his head. He said softly, "Boss, do you really feel that there's nothing wrong with your body?" Li Nanheng glanced at him indifferently. What problem could there be? As he spoke, he moved to stand up again. Boss, don't get up. You've just woken up. No matter what, you should eat something and rest well for the night. You don't have much strength right now. I'll go check on Fengling." "Why are you checking on Fengling?" "Fengling is still sleeping. Earlier, when I went next door to get something, I saw that she was asleep. When we entered, we said that Boss had already woken up. She didn't say that she wanted to come over. She should really be feeling unwell. Otherwise, based on Fengling's concern for Boss, she would definitely come over immediately." Li Nanheng did not speak. He only watched Fatty's radiant expression. After a moment, he asked coldly, "Did you do something wrong? Your entire face is filled with guilt." Fat Tai immediately choked on his own saliva. He coughed several times before looking at his boss in shock. He immediately sat down by the bed to explain. "Boss, I really did it for your own good. I was afraid that you would feel too uncomfortable, so I did it." Li Nanheng frowned. What did you do? A few nights ago, when I was taking care of you here, I was afraid that your headache would be too uncomfortable. Not long ago, I experienced the feeling of my head exploding. To help you alleviate the pain, I fed you a bottle of white wine. Fatai pointed to the empty bottles by the side as he spoke. The other bottles were originally used to help you cool down and wipe your body. I saw that there were so many bottles left, so I directly opened one and fed it to you. Li Nanheng immediately looked at him coldly, as though he was looking at a lunatic. When Fatai shrank his neck on the bed with a frightened expression, he said coldly, I was wondering why my throat felt so uncomfortable these few days. Drinking on his own and being forced to drink were two completely different feelings. Fatai chuckled guiltily. Boss, it's good that you're fine. Li Nanheng rolled his eyes at him. Right now, he did not have any strength. If he had the strength, he would really kick him off the bed. All right, scram. Fatai did not dare to stay for a moment longer. He immediately hid behind a bin and Hu, following them to prepare food for Boss. After waiting for an entire night, Foam Ling did not return. Li Nanheng ate some simple food and was supported to the tent's window. Through the window, he saw Foam Ling lying on the bed next door, covered with a blanket. He did not say anything and was supported back to the bed. The next morning, Li Nanheng got up and got out of bed. Seeing that Boss had really recovered, everyone didn't stop him. When Li Nanheng was about to walk out of the tent, they hurriedly took the winter clothes and put them on for him. Boss, it's getting colder these days. You've just recovered. Don't catch a cold again. Chapter 896. Compared to this tent that was especially lively after Li Nanheng woke up, the tent next door was relatively quiet. Only the occasional crackling sound came from the stove on the ground. Li Nanheng walked directly to the only bed in the pile of beds. The bed was bulging, and Foam Ling lay unmoving inside. The blanket was still covering her head. Yesterday, Fatai had said that Foam Ling had been feeling unwell these days, but for some reason, when she slept, she always covered her head with a blanket. She did not speak, nor did she want others to see her face. They all thought that she had frostbite and refused to see others. However, when they helped Foam Ling wipe her face that day, they did not see any frostbite. Her face was white and clean like usual, but she always covered herself with the blanket. If it weren't for the fact that they knew Foam Ling's temper was usually so reticent, and that she did not like to speak when she was unwell, everyone would have thought that Foam Ling had isolated herself from the world. The man looked down at the simple bed in front of him. Foam Ling usually did not sleep with others. During the days when he was sick, she did not care about the trifles and slept on Dabin's bed for several days. Foam Ling, he called out. The person on the bed did not move. Covered by the blanket, she did not seem to hear him. Li Nanheng's gaze turned cold. He raised his foot and kicked the side of the bed twice. The person on the bed still did not move. Li Nanheng reached out to tug the blanket off her body, only to find that the person inside was not asleep. Instead, she was holding onto the blanket tightly, unwilling to let go. The man narrowed his eyes coldly. What are you doing? Why are you hiding in the blanket?
Come out.
The person under the blanket still did not come out. In fact, she held on even tighter. Li Nanheng's expression was cold as he used force. As he tugged the blanket away, Foam Ling, who had been lying on the bed for 3 days, suddenly grabbed a pillow and smashed it harshly against his face. Li Nanheng was caught off guard. Of course, he did not expect her to suddenly throw the pillow at him. He was hit by the pillow. It did not hurt, but the man's eyes were filled with hostility as he glared at her. The pillow fell in front of him and landed on the ground. Foam Ling rolled from one bed to the other, but the one next to her was Fatty's quilt. Fatai usually didn't shower, so she was unwilling to lift his quilt to cover herself. She simply rolled to a place 3 or 4 beds away, sat up, and was about to get off the bed. She didn't even look at him. Li Nanheng stood in place and watched her movements and the expression on her face. He narrowed his eyes slightly. What are you doing? Since you've woken up, you should be resting in the tent. Why did you come here to torment me? Foam Ling put on her shoes and stood up. Originally, she wanted to walk out, but her rationality reminded her that she could not do this. She resisted the urge to shoot him and turned to look at him. For 3 whole days, she had been lying there for 3 whole days. Her body and heart were finally starting to recover. She was no longer as sore as before, but her first time had still fallen into the hands of this bastard. It hurt so much that even her nightmares these 2 days were filled with scenes of him fiercely penetrating her body. They said that in order to take care of me, you didn't sleep for several days and fell sick. I just woke up last night. This morning I had the strength to get off the bed, so I came to take a look. The man looked at her angry face and walked over. He was about to tug her hand over, but Foam Ling quickly dodged. Seeing her suddenly rejecting him, Li Nanheng walked up to her and lowered his eyes to look at her coldly. What's wrong with you? Why are you throwing a tantrum like a woman? And why are you throwing a tantrum without warning? What did I do to provoke you again, En? Foam Ling's expression faltered, and she abruptly raised her eyes to look at him. The man had really just recovered from a serious illness. His handsome and indifferent face looked a little thinner, and his face was also a little pale. He stood in front of her and stared at her face, as if he wanted to see through her. Foam Ling's heart immediately skipped a beat. Without waiting for her to speak, Li Nanheng coldly narrowed his eyes. Because I fell into the ice hole that day and scared you? Foam Ling was silent for a moment.
No.
Then why are you giving me that look? Foam Ling clenched her fists by her sides. He didn't remember.
He didn't know.
He actually didn't remember anything. For a moment, she didn't know whether she should be glad or angry. She was glad that her secret could still be kept. She could still continue to live in 11 Base. She didn't need to be separated from this group of brothers and didn't need to be driven out. What she was angry about was that this man didn't remember anything after doing that to her. Foam Ling's heart had never been so complicated. She clenched her fingers tightly. When Li Nanheng noticed her abnormal expression and leaned over to look at her, she was about to take a step back, but the man took a step forward and held her chin. Li Nanheng looked at her and said, Li Nanheng, don't worry. The moment his fingers touched her, Foam Ling's mind suddenly recalled that night when this man's hands touched her body. Those flames, she suddenly trembled all over and wanted to retreat, but the man held her chin and looked into her eyes. If you have something to say, say it. Don't hold it in. She immediately turned her head away and raised her hand to slap his hand down. No, I'm just not feeling well and don't want to deal with too many people and things. Since boss has just recovered from a serious illness, go back to rest. There's no need to come to see me. I'm fine. You're so haggard. If I didn't know better, I would think that the person who had a high fever for 6 or 7 days was you, Li Nanheng said coldly. Foam Ling sneered inwardly. Who was the one who tortured her to this state? She did not explain. After a moment, she asked, Fatai fed you alcohol that night. Do you remember? Li Nanheng looked at her. I don't remember. I was muddle-headed from the fever and was fed alcohol. Do you think I'm an immortal who can stay sober at all times? If I hadn't heard them mention it after I woke up, I probably wouldn't have known that I was almost murdered with alcohol in my illness. Foam Ling. Looking at her expression, Li Nanheng suddenly narrowed his deep, black eyes. Did something else happen that night when Fatai forced me to drink? Or was there another reason? What's with your expression?
No.
Foam Ling raised her eyes to look at him. His eyes were calm and puzzled, but her gaze was not so calm. She only met his gaze for a moment before quickly looking away. Seeing Foam Ling's sudden expression and attitude, Li Nanheng's expression did not change, but he clearly sensed that something was wrong. Chapter 897. Foam Ling originally thought that she would have to deal with Li Nanheng for a long time because of her gender being discovered. However, since the heavens were helping her, even if she was extremely unhappy, she could only endure it. In the end, she did not say a single word about that matter. However, just because Foam Ling did not mention it, it did not mean that Li Nanheng did not notice her abnormality. It had been more than a week since he had recovered from his illness. Feng Ling did not even ask for a change of accommodation. She directly moved a foldable bed over and placed it by the 1.5-meter-tall bed. Not only that, she directly asked Dabin to sleep with him in this tent. She squeezed with the others in the other tent and slept on Dabin's original bed. Her explanation was that recently, her mental condition was not too good, and she could not shoulder the responsibility of taking care of Boss. If Boss's illness had not fully recovered, it would be convenient for Dabin to take care of him. She would sleep by the side with the others. In any case, they were all grown men. It did not matter which side they slept on. This situation had already lasted for nearly a week, almost 10 days. Nightfall. Li Nanheng placed one hand under his head and laid on the bed. He watched as Dabin returned from his patrol. He shook the snow off his head and entered the bathroom to wash up. Not long after, he walked out bare-chested. He lifted the blankets and burrowed into the blankets. He comfortably hugged the blankets and hummed a few times. Then he said, "Boss, I'm asleep. Good night." Li Nanheng made an indifferent sound through his nose. It was as though he was responding, but also as though he was snorting coldly. In less than 5 minutes, continuous snoring sounds could be heard from Dabin's bed. Accompanied by their rhythmic snoring, Li Nanheng closed his eyes, but he couldn't fall asleep at all. The moment he closed his eyes, he saw Feng Ling's expressionless face during the training in the snow for the past 2 days, and every time he approached her, Feng Ling instinctively took a step back and maintained a distance with her cold eyes. The snoring grew louder and louder. Li Nanheng abruptly lifted the quilt and got up. He picked up his winter suit and put it on. Then he walked out. He went to the tent next door and watched a group of men snoring in a crooked posture. Li Nanheng walked to the innermost bed with a dark face. Feng Ling was sleeping properly on the bed, and there was no sound. The quilt was neatly covering her body. As the man approached, Feng Ling abruptly opened her eyes due to being stared at by a pair of eyes. However, before she could see clearly that the person by the bed was sleeping, the blanket over her was abruptly lifted. She abruptly sat up and was about to defend herself when Li Nanheng threw the quilt aside and saw the man's face clearly. The coldness in her eyes instantly turned into calmness. She said lightly, "Boss, get up and go to sleep next door with me." Without saying anything, the man looked at her coldly, not to discuss with her, but to order. Feng Ling sat on the bed, without moving. "Boss, it's quite good for me to sleep here. Also, it's convenient for Dabin to take care of you." "Take care of what? Do you see how weak I am? I've long recovered. Why would I need someone to take care of me?" The man's tone was impatient.
Don't talk nonsense.
"Hurry and go back with me." Feng Ling refused to reply. She insisted on sitting on the bed. "Isn't it the same for me and Dabin to sleep on?" "Boss, why do you insist on me going back?" Li Nanheng glanced at the men who were snoring loudly. "How can you sleep with this kind of snoring? Dabin is even louder than them. No matter how long I stay in the base, I sleep alone. You can sleep quietly and won't disturb me. Dabin can't. He's too noisy." Although Boss Li was used to sleeping alone, she heard that he could even sleep in the mud when he was out on missions. There were many comrades by his side, and his snoring at night was not lacking. Why did he have to be so spoiled here? Feng Ling glanced at Dahu. Dahu doesn't make much noise when he sleeps. "You can call Dahu over." Before she could finish speaking, the man reached out and grabbed her collar, dragging her down. Just as Feng Ling was about to struggle, he pulled her into his arms. He pressed her shoulders firmly and looked down at her condescendingly. "Don't talk nonsense. Go back with me. Let go." Every time he touched her, Feng Ling's hair stood on end. Especially in such a position, her nose was instantly enveloped by the man's body heat and the scent of his hormones. She was so sensitive that she felt uncomfortable all over. Not only did Li Nanheng not let go, but he also did not take her winter clothes. In any case, when the others heard that it was him, they let down their guard. They turned over and continued to sleep, snoring everywhere. No one would look at them. He directly opened his wide winter clothes and wrapped Foam Ling in his arms. Just like that, he forcefully brought her out of the tent. Foam Ling struggled the entire way, but was still forcefully dragged into the neighboring tent by the man's brute force. When they arrived at Dabin's bedside, Li Nanheng kicked the bedside. Dabin abruptly woke up. He thought that something had happened and was about to quickly put on his clothes out of habit. However, he abruptly saw Boss Li's heavy expression and Foam Ling's unsightly expression. His brain momentarily went into a state of stupor. Several seconds later, he finally reacted. Scram back to sleep next door. Li Nanheng was expressionless. His voice was cold, as though if he dared to stay here for one more second, he would directly kick him down the mountain. Dabin did not say a word. He was sleepy, and it did not matter where he slept. He quickly got off the bed. As he was only wearing a pair of large underpants, he was afraid that it would be too cold outside, so he wrapped the blanket around himself and quickly ran out. Looking at the empty bed, Foam Ling was about to say that there was no blanket and that she should return next door. However, before she could speak, the man directly kicked the light folding bed to the side and forcefully dragged her back to the bed that had always been hers. He pressed her down by the bed. The moment Foam Ling touched this bed, she felt as though she was traumatized. She trembled and wanted to stand up, but the man pressed down on her shoulders and firmly made her sit down. Stay here obediently. Sleep the way you slept in the past. Li Nanheng watched her coldly. My illness has already recovered. My temperature is normal. I won't infect you, and I don't need you to take care of me all night. Now lie down and sleep. Foam Ling struggled for a moment, and the man finally moved his hand away from her shoulder. Chapter 898. When she got up and was about to go over, Li Nanheng stood by the bed and looked at her indifferently. He didn't say a word, but his eyes and movements clearly showed that he didn't allow her to go over. Foam Ling had no choice but to sit back down because of his forceful posture. Foam Ling, did I offend you during my stay in Rogers Pass? The man looked at her with narrowed eyes.
No.
Why are you throwing a tantrum?
Lie down.
Li Nanheng resisted the urge to tear down the folding bed next to him and looked down at her. I don't want to say it again. Lie down and sleep right now. Foam Ling didn't want to show her temper too obviously, but after so many days, she knew that Li Nanheng was calm enough. Now that she had returned to this tent, it was useless for her to do anything. She could only pretend that nothing had happened. After remaining silent for almost half a minute, she straightened her clothes and tugged her collar, which had been pulled crookedly by him earlier. She laid down, flipped over, and lay on the innermost side of the bed with her back facing him. She closed her eyes and was about to fall asleep like this. Li Nanheng didn't force her to do anything else. He just looked at her for a moment by the bed, threw his winter clothes aside, and lay down. The moment the man laid down, Foam Ling thought that it would be fine for her to sleep with her back facing him. However, as soon as he laid down, even though the two of them were separated by at least 20 centimeters, her sensitive body tightened. The memory of that night on this bed invaded her mind, making it impossible for her to calm down and fall asleep. After lying down, Li Nanheng raised his hand in satisfaction because it was still the same person beside him. He rested his head on his arm and closed his eyes. It was quiet at night. Foam Ling had been pretending to sleep with her eyes closed, but the man behind her seemed to have fallen asleep. His breathing was even and steady. She couldn't fall asleep at all. She quietly sat up and was about to find a chance to get out of bed, when the man still rested his head on his arm and closed his eyes suddenly spoke, and his voice was sleepy and hoarse. Sleep well. Don't think about running out to feel the cold wind. Foam Ling paused. She tried to control herself, turned to look at the man with his eyes closed, and said impatiently, I can't sleep. Go out for a walk. Li Nanheng opened his eyes and looked at her. Why can't you sleep? Something on your mind?
Or, because of me.
I just don't understand. I've only had a high fever for a few days. Why are you suddenly showing me such an expression? No, I haven't been feeling well recently. I don't have the patience to do anything. Boss, you don't have to pay so much attention to me. It's all an unnecessary misunderstanding. Foam Ling's expression was stiff. Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes and sneered. Don't you know why I deliberately paid attention to you? She abruptly recalled the 2 times he had openly confessed to her. She paused and did not speak anymore. She lay back down, pulled the quilt over herself, and was about to sleep. She did not want to speak another word with him. She really didn't know whether she should be glad that he didn't remember or angry that he didn't remember. Perhaps both. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been so uncomfortable in her heart for so many days. She didn't want to talk to him, didn't want to see him, didn't want to stand too close to him, didn't want to smell his scent, and didn't even want to hear his breathing when he slept. After living for so many years, Foam Ling thought that she was indifferent to everything and did not care about it at all. In the end, she was completely defeated by Li Nanheng. For the first time, she knew how it felt to be impetuous every day because of a man. She didn't sleep very well that night. After forcing herself to fall asleep, she still had nightmares. In the dream, she stood in the conference hall of the base, surrounded by a group of leaders of the base, the elders of the Li family, the leaders of the United States and the United Nations. Everyone was pointing at her and talking angrily. They were angry that she had deceived everyone and that a man had hidden in the base for so many years without being discovered. In the dream, even though Foam Ling was scolded by a group of people, she still stood upright in the middle, neither humble nor pushy. Then, someone threw something at her head. Even though she didn't know what was thrown and didn't feel any pain, there were still things being thrown at her. She turned around and saw that it was those people who surrounded her, who kept scolding and throwing things at her. Some people even came up and forcibly tore her clothes apart, forcing her to show them the breast wrap inside. A group of people frowned at her breast wrap and looked displeased. In the end, everyone shook their heads and left. Then they suddenly handed her a letter of dismissal, ordering her to leave the base and never to approach 11 base again. This dream made Foam Ling toss and turn. She kept frowning and didn't sleep well. She had already regarded the base as her home. She didn't want to leave. If she left the base, she didn't even know what to do in the future. Hearing that Foam Ling didn't sleep well after falling asleep, Li Nanheng opened his eyes and looked at her, only to see that there was a layer of sweat on her forehead and she had been frowning as if she was struggling and resisting something in her dream. He stared at her for a moment, then reached out and pulled her into his arms. Then, using the position of hugging her to sleep, he looked down at the fine sweat on the tip of her nose. He wiped the tip of her nose with his fingers and then gently patted her shoulder. The loneliness and fear in the nightmare had been surrounding her. Suddenly, Li Nanheng's figure appeared in the base hall. When everyone was about to drive her out of the base, the man walked up to her and suddenly held her in his arms. The warmth in the man's arms suddenly made her feel a sense of belonging. She stood stiffly and didn't move. She couldn't hear the man's voice above her head, but could only feel the warmth in the man's arms. Perhaps it was really useful to sleep in his arms. Seeing Foam Ling's frown gradually relax in her sleep, Li Nanheng smiled lightly and raised his hand to rub the short hair on her head. It was only when she was asleep that he could take advantage of the distance between them to hug her.
He felt that he might really be possessed.
Not only did he have feelings for a man, but he also left the base for him and lived in a damn place like Rogers Pass for nearly a month. There was a unique fragrance on Foam Ling's body. It was not only the scent of the shower gel, but also the fragrance lingered in his nose. Chapter 899. However, before he kissed her, at such a close distance, Li Nanheng suddenly went into a trance. He looked at Foam Ling's face and then at her lips. Such a distance, such a kiss angle, some strange images suddenly flashed through his mind. Those images didn't seem to be scenes he had experienced in a dream, but something that had happened in reality. When did he press her down on this bed? And when had he kissed her on this bed? But the scene that popped up in his mind made him stare at Foam Ling's face with a heavy gaze. Since coming to Rogers Pass, although he had never hidden his feelings for Foam Ling, he had never done anything that she didn't like. After all, In the base, he only kissed her that night, but she dared to raise a gun against him the next day. He was not so beastly as to do anything to her when Foam Ling had been resisting. But those images couldn't have appeared for no reason. He kept looking at Foam Ling's face and tried hard to recall, but he could only recall the images of him pressing her down on the bed and kissing her, and he was not sure if it was the scene he had dreamed of at night. In order to recall clearly, Li Nanheng directly kissed her on the lips. Foam Ling's lips were so soft that he wanted to drill his tongue into them and entangle them deeply. He restrained the impulse and only felt those images in his mind flickering. Making sure that Foam Ling's nightmare should be over, Li Nanheng let go of her, let her lie flat on the bed, sat up, looked at Foam Ling, and then turned his eyes to the small table beside the bed. There was no wine bottle on the small table, but when he glanced at it, he remembered that there were several empty bottles on the small table on the day he woke up. Did it have anything to do with the wine that Fatai fed him that night? The next day, it was Fatty's turn to patrol. However, when he was about to go down the mountain, he suddenly found that Boss Lee had also come. The two of them went down the mountain side by side. Fatai looked flattered. "Boss, are you going to patrol with me?" Li Nanheng glanced at the white snow around and said coldly, "I want to ask you something." What do you want to ask, boss?" "Did anything else happen the night you forced me to drink when I had a high fever?" Fatai thought back carefully.
"No."
"That night, when I said I gave you alcohol, Foam Ling was very angry and directly chased me out. But that night, Dabin was patrolling. He probably went back to check on you in the middle of the night. If something happened, he would definitely tell us. That night, Foam Ling stayed in the tent to take care of you. Foam Ling didn't sleep for several days and kept watching over you. What else could have happened? Foam Ling is very angry." "That's right. Just like everyone else, when they heard that I forced you to drink, they all scolded me for being unreliable. Foam Ling scolded me the same way and then chased me out. In fact, that night I was supposed to take care of you, boss. I wanted to let her have a good rest, but she must have been worried. After sleeping for an afternoon, she went over again. I saw that Foam Ling was angry at that time, so I was afraid that I would really anger her, so I left. That's it."
"Yeah."
"Nothing else happened?"
"No."
"At that time, I was in the tent next door and didn't fall asleep for a while. In fact, I was worried that it was not good to force you to drink. I sat on the bed and thought for a long time." "You didn't hear anything at that time?" "No, it was very quiet." "How long did you sit on the bed and think after returning to the tent?" "About 5 minutes." Li Nanheng: Hey, boss, why are you leaving? Don't you want to patrol with me? Don't you still have questions to ask? Why are you leaving, boss?" They had thought that they would stay at Rogers Pass for at least 3 months. To their surprise, after a month, they suddenly received an urgent notice from the base. The big shots of the United Nations and the U.S. military were going to visit 11 base. They were very confident and curious about the current situation of the sniper team, so they came to take a look in person. The training of the sniper team had been suspended for a month because of Foam Ling's deployment. Now they had to be called back to resume training immediately. Otherwise, if the 5 members of the sniper team were still immature when they returned, the U.S. military would take this opportunity to slander 11 base and take back the authority assigned to the base. Foam Ling didn't say anything. When Foam Ling went back, the others would definitely go back with her. After all, they came together and had to leave together. To be fair, if there were still people stationed here, another group of people from the base would be sent here. Li Nanheng planned to directly send several elites from the base over, so the mission at Rogers Pass ended 2 months ahead of schedule. Autumn had officially entered Los Angeles, and the temperature in the area where the base was located was at least 7 or 8 degrees lower than a month ago. And after returning to the base, they could no longer eat and drink every day like when they were in Rogers Pass. In an instant, they were busy with training in various training camps. The training schedule of the sniper team was quickly accelerated. The training that usually added up to about 7 or 8 hours was increased to 10 hours. There were also 2 more hours of training at night. Several special sniper training sessions were also added. Li Nanheng personally joined the training team and took turns to train the 5 of them with Xiao Fei. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the training ended and Fengling went straight back to her residence. After coming back, everyone was busy these days. Li Nanheng didn't go to the base's conference room for a meeting today. When Fengling walked back to her residence, he happened to go downstairs, and the two went upstairs together. Fengling walked forward all the way without looking back, without saying a word or greeting him. Li Nanheng looked at her cold back, walked to the floor where she lived, and was about to tell her about the recent arrangements of the base for the sniper team. However, when they arrived at the door, Fengling opened the door and went in, slammed the door with a bang, and didn't even give him a chance to speak. Standing in the corridor with the automatic lights on, looking at the closed door next door, Li Nanheng's eyebrows twitched. Just as he was about to walk over, suddenly, his cell phone rang. Li Nanheng picked up the phone. After hearing what the person on the other side said, he paused, looked at the closed door in front of him with a meaningful look, and turned to walk out. Chapter 900. Li Nanheng took the things they handed over, looked at them, and glanced at one of them. Did you find it under the chair? Yes, after the two of us finished the training of Team 3, we sat in the canteen and drank tea for a while. Just now, we were a little hungry, so we ordered 2 servings of rice, so we stayed here for a long time. Fengling was eating here before. Fengling. It was her again. Li Nanheng quietly clenched the small piece of sanitary napkin wrapped in a white translucent thing in his hand. Although they were all men and never touched this thing, it didn't mean that they didn't know what it was used for. Boss, that. A member of Team 3 stepped forward and whispered to Li Nanheng, I heard from the brothers of Team 1 that Fengling usually doesn't live with us. Is she really? He pointed to the thing in Li Nanheng's hand again and whispered, Is she a woman? Li Nanheng's expression was indifferent. It's too arbitrary to determine whether a person is a man or a woman based on this kind of thing. Besides, if she is really a woman, you guys from Team 3 can't even beat a woman. Don't you have the face to stay in 11 base? The two of them were speechless and looked at each other. Fengling was usually so delicate and tender. If it weren't for the fact that she was very agile and fierce in every assessment and training, everyone would have long suspected her. But seeing that Boss didn't allow them to talk nonsense in the base before they confirmed the truth, the two of them didn't dare to talk nonsense anymore. However, it was not difficult to see from their eyes that this kind of suspicion had long existed in the hearts of the members of the base. However, it was Fengling's convincing skills that stopped everyone from talking. In addition, everyone in the sniper team was united, so no one dared to speak carelessly. Thus, even if there were some people who liked to spread rumors and ask around, they couldn't find any concrete evidence. They could only spread a little bit like gossip, but it didn't affect the peace on the surface. Li Nanheng looked at the small piece of sanitary napkin in his hand again and was about to turn back. Suddenly, a voice came from the side.
Oh.
Boss Li, how did this thing? Hearing the movement behind him, Li Nanheng turned his eyes expressionlessly, only to see the only woman in the canteen, Auntie Jelly, who was already 45 years old, walking over anxiously. Looking at the things in his hand, she wanted to take them away, but she didn't dare to do so because the other party was Boss Li, so she didn't know whether to raise her hand or withdraw it. Li Nanheng glanced at her and frowned. Is this yours? Auntie Jelly nodded again and said with some embarrassment, Oh, I'm really old. I always do stupid things. Last month, I went out of the base and bought a bag of this stuff. I left it on the cabinet in the storage room in front of the cafeteria. It happened to be a few days ago, so I used it directly and put the rest in my pocket. Just now, when I came to clean the tables and chairs here, I didn't pay much attention, and a piece fell out. Although I'm so old and my children are about the same age as you, it's still too embarrassing for you young men to see this. Boss Li, I'm really sorry. Auntie Jelly said as she walked over nervously and took the piece of sanitary napkin from Li Nanheng's open palm. After taking it, she took out a big bag of sanitary napkins from the canvas bag she was carrying. The men present looked at it and found that the small piece was the same as the one in her big bag. The color, style, and size were all the same. In front of them, Annie Jelly put the small piece of sanitary napkin back into the big bag with embarrassment, which was neat and not awkward at all. Bosley, I'm really sorry. I will pay attention to it in the future. I know that there are few women in 11 base. This thing may be like big news in the eyes of the young men. I will definitely put it away in the future. Auntie Jet continued to apologize apologetically, and her eyes were full of guilt. Li Nanheng didn't say much, but just said lightly, "Well, put away your things. Auntie Jelly, as the only woman in the entire base, you'd better not misunderstand me." When he said this, his eyes were already looking at the two people from Team 3. The two men immediately understood what boss meant. So this was just a misunderstanding? This thing belonged to Auntie Jelly? So it wasn't left here by Foamling at all? If that was really the case, then it was indeed a big mistake. The two hurriedly nodded and said with smiles, "It's a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding. We saw Foamling eating here, so we thought it might be her food. But since it's not, it must be a misunderstanding. It seems like we've made a mountain out of a molehill. Well, we'll leave first. Boss, you should go back and rest early." With that, the two men pushed each other and hurried out. When the two men left, Auntie Jelly nodded politely and respectfully to Li Nanheng, said a few words of apology, and turned to go back to work. Li Nanheng stood in the canteen of the base for a while without any movement. He just looked at the empty and dark training grounds outside the window, the lonely lights around the ground, and the night sky with only a few stars outside the window. These days after returning to the base, there were some strange images hovering in his mind every night. Some kisses, entanglements on the bed, and even some actions that only men and women would do on the bed. He thought it was just a dream, but it seemed like a dream. With such suspicions, he tried to ask Foamling about it for several days, but Foamling kept avoiding him. He heard that Auntie Jelly continued to clean up, and the cleaning machine and sterilizer were pushed out. This was the disinfection process that must be done in the canteen after dinner every day. Li Nanheng glanced at it, turned, and walked out. Seeing that Li Nanheng's tall figure had walked out of the canteen and into the night without looking back, Auntie Jelly immediately put down her hands on the two machines and looked forward for a long time. A few minutes later, after confirming that Boss Li had really left, she breathed a long sigh of relief and quickly picked up her cell phone to make a call. Foamling had just returned to her residence and was about to take a bath, but because of her period, she hesitated. It seemed that it was not convenient to take a bath today, so she could only wipe her body. Chapter 901. Little Phone. Auntie Jet Li's voice came from the other end of the phone. She lowered her voice and whispered, "I was scared to death. I was almost discovered just now." "Almost discovered what?" Foamling wondered. "The 2 sanitary napkins I gave you. How could you be so careless? You left them in the canteen and were discovered by 2 guys in the base. Fortunately, I saw them when I came out. Otherwise, I don't know what would have happened." Foamling's calm expression froze. She frowned and searched her body. Sure enough, the sanitary napkins Auntie Jia Li gave her were gone. When she was about 13.5 years old, about a few months after she entered the base, her period came for the first time. Since then, her period had been very accurate every month. At that time, she looked up some information on the internet and learned about the physical changes of girls during puberty. Then she took advantage of the weekends when she could leave the base to buy all kinds of sanitary napkins and secretly stored them. Because her period was very accurate every month, she remembered it and never made a mistake. But last month, probably because of the extreme weather on Rogers Pass, which affected all aspects of her body, this month's period actually came 5 days ahead of schedule. She was unprepared. When she was eating alone in the canteen in the evening, Auntie Jelly passed by behind. She got up and was about to pour water, when she suddenly asked in a low voice in surprise, "Little Foam, why are you bleeding?" Foamling froze and looked back, only to see a small piece of blood overflowing from the back of her trousers on the chair. Although it was only a small piece, Auntie Jelly, who was also a woman, saw through her at that time. Feng Ling liked to go to the cafeteria to eat the food cooked by Auntie Jelly and would often help out in the cafeteria. Auntie Jelly had always liked her very much. When she heard that Feng Ling was an orphan, she always felt sorry for her and treated her as her godson. Therefore, after Feng Ling's explanation, Auntie Jelly agreed to help her hide the truth and gave her 2 menstrual pads. At that time, Feng Ling went directly into the bathroom to use one and put the other in her trouser pocket. She didn't notice it and went back to her seat to continue eating, but she accidentally dropped it on the ground. Who discovered it? A warning immediately popped up in Feng Ling's mind, and her eyelids twitched. It seems to be Team 3, but it's okay. I explained it to them. Anyway, I brought it to you. I took out my big bag and let them see that it was mine. I told them that I accidentally dropped it in the canteen when I was cleaning here. Auntie Jelly said with a smile, but you must be careful in the future. Auntie Jelly said with a smile, but you must be careful in the future. It's really bold of you to pretend to be a man at such a young age. I can help you today, but I may not be able to continue to help you in the future. Besides, there are so many people in the base. You were still a child a few years ago, so you could pretend to be a man in front of young boys. But girls and boys will be completely different after they are 17 or 18 years old. You will be more and more obvious in all aspects. You may be discovered one day. Ling Ling Heart Ling Ling said, I foam jelly foam. Foam Ling sigh. It's not that troublesome. It's just that my heart is constantly beating fast, afraid that you'll be discovered. Sigh. Auntie Jelly was about to say that Boss Lee also saw it just now, but the timer on the cleaner beside her hand rang. She came back to herself and said, I have to continue cleaning. I have to talk to you later. Be careful. If you are discovered, you will really be driven out of the base. I don't want you to be driven out. Feng Ling nodded gratefully, and the two hung up the phone. Auntie Jelly sighed, put her cell phone in her pocket, and turned to continue cleaning the canteen. However, at the moment she turned around, she was startled, took a step back, and stared blankly at the man who had returned to the canteen. The tall man was standing 2 meters behind her. His dark and cold eyes were staring at her coldly. It was like an X-ray that no one could avoid, exposing her lies in an instant. Lily, boss. Auntie Jelly's face turned pale, and she clenched the handrail of the cleaner nervously. The man's cold and deep voice suddenly sounded.
Who did you give those 2 pieces to?
Who disguised as a man and mingled in the base at such a young age. Auntie Jelly's heart beat wildly, feeling that a big secret was about to be revealed because of her. Usually there would be no one in the canteen at this time. She was used to cleaning here alone and thought she was alone. She didn't expect that Boss Lee would come back. From his words, it was clear that he had been listening from the moment she called Feng Ling. What should she do? Who will be driven out of the base after being found out? The man's eyebrows were sharp, and his silent and deep eyes were cold. Auntie Jelly clenched the handrail of the cleaner and didn't know what to say. He helped Feng Ling hide the truth because he liked that child. It was out of affection, but it was also her duty to tell the truth to the boss of 11 Base. After all, she had a stable job in the base for so many years and relied on the Li family's money to support her. And since Li Nanheng suddenly came back, it was obvious that he had long suspected that those words just now were just for the 2 boys of Team 3 to hear. So Boss Lee was protecting Feng Ling's reputation, right? Looking at Auntie Jelly's hesitant expression, Li Nanheng's eyes were cold. Tell me the truth. Auntie Jelly bit her lip and didn't know whether to say it or not, but Li Nanheng snorted coldly. Is Feng Ling a woman? Although it was a question, it was obviously a very definite answer. There were many doubts about a person and all kinds of coincidences connected together. When there were too many, it was no longer a coincidence, and the doubts were no longer doubts, but conclusive evidence. This. Auntie Jelly was so anxious that her eyes turned red, as if she was about to cry. If it weren't for the fact that Boss Lee hated lying, she would have knelt down to him and begged him not to drive Feng Ling out of the base. She said with red eyes and trembling voice, Boss, although I only work in the canteen, I think it's the same whether they are male or female, as long as I can. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.